Oh, there's you.
So how do you know? Yeah. Thanks. Oh,
You guys last year?
I love those cards, because you're just like, oh, it's really interesting. I know that it is. I've been working hard. No. I work, I'm going.
Okay.
I'm no longer into your, I really go everywhere, I never had last before, I really like it. I like this one. Like, I'm teaching, employment discrimination, only half, about 14 students in class. Sometimes it's a little weird if you, I think it's set up now a little better than it was at one point, like you get in the middle and you couldn't get out, you know? And you're trying to use, the only thing I don't like the number is that the desk is backed up so much against the wall. You can barely get out from behind that desk. And, you know, and if you want to use your clicker, maybe you might go home and that's your although we were looking at the salad the other night. And I was wondering whether we went on that.
Oh.
Who's that?
So this is, yeah, over here.
That's what, do they know the students? I know.
Yeah, morning.
I mean, I couldn't get the desk to work, so it's down.
No, I could.
And in addition to that, we went for a slideshow. We didn't do a slideshow, just showed all the slides on the side. I just gave up on it. There's just not a lot of slides myself. Because you're also there. It's one. Whoever designed this didn't ask for it. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That one. Right, you're right. Well, and the other thing, the way
You know,
it's
from a legal
designed,
perspective,
the computer screen should be turned on, because there's no keyboard. Because you know, some of us do. Oh.
That's like a perfect storm.
Yeah.
laundry was just like making legal remedies basically impossible.
Okay, I won't take the leaving. Yeah, I'll be back.
I had a system with contacts. It's like for guys like me or
Sure.
Well, apparently, what, now that you can sue the state.
Yes.
Did you read that? This is the medical district?
Yes.
Fascinating, and like the district court rules are so awesome.
Yeah.
They even said that you can't sue for medical wages.
Tina, how are you? Welcome, welcome. Leon Buford, you're gonna tie this? Hi. Welcome. Thanks for being here. Try to stay on. Yes, definitely. Okay. Okay, great. Hi, Chris. How are you? Welcome.
Actually, let's go this way because of the light from the
Great.
It was not there, you got it.
Thank you. All right. Well,
So is this your new logo of that's the national organization?
this is the national, this is the logo of the local organization. Here is the legal director for the national organization, Chris Newman.
I'm the legal director for the National Metabolic Trade. This is our brand new.
It's over on my own, Eastern and Charleston.
I'm visiting Los Angeles.
Well, that's right in our district.
Right, you're just, only District 1, right?
Well, it's, you're much later here, because the national economy is coming back and building started.
Great event in November. Co-sponsored with ACS. That was a great start to the partnership with Bliss, met with already. She's just working tirelessly on these fronts and doing a great job here. Much needed.
Well, now, I know you got the immigration clinic, do you have a clinic for this specifically, or does it lead into that?
We don't have a plan for this specifically, but we're definitely one of the most beneficial opportunities for students, especially with the Reliable Mortgage Center, to try and feed some of them into the
That's the idea. Yeah, that's the idea. I got my start actually. Also, great project.
Well, it could also get involved in a lot of the legislature, because you got a number of members of the legislature for 4 years.
Yes, yes.
It's a good mix. Across the country, you see a lot of things all over. One day we all want to get back in Congress and.
I don't know. Maybe after the next election, we'll find out.
So we're all here as much as we can, so we should probably start with welcome you and give you some time to welcome the group, and then we get started at the first.
So, Pero ¿por qué hablar? Voy a aceptar ¿Cómo está, compañero? No, sí, bueno. Aquí vamos a ver. Ya.
And the phone was, she made it.
Step up, step
Move that way, go in front of the.
Let her bear here.
Le voy a pasar con alguien que trabaja aquí en Okay, everyone, on three. 1, 2, 3. Someone get this time. Very nice, thank you.
Oh, perfect. Excellent. Keep in touch. Okay, good morning. Buenos dias a todos. Buenos dias. My name is Ruben Garcia. I am a professor here at Boyd School of Law, Associate Dean for Faculty Development and Research. I bring you welcome on behalf of our Dean, Dan Hamilton, who couldn't be here today, but we're very proud to be part of this event and part of this launch of the Las Vegas Workers Center, which will be continuing today, and we'll hear more about that event later today. But we have a very special panel today on day labor in Las Vegas, employer indiscretions in City City. And we have some fantastic guests, which will be introduced to you shortly. But again, I want to thank, in the beginning, all the people who made this event possible. Clearly, the staff you see outside have been working very hard on this event. Terry Greenman, Amy Baker, Sandra Rodriguez, and they, of course, have been very instrumental in putting this together. Of course, I want to thank UNLV Workplace Law Program, my colleague Ken Kinley, the director of that program, who is sponsoring this event, and also the sponsors La Voz and the Undocu Network. I want to thank all of you for being here in the audience, and of course our guests from far and wide, including the National Day Laborers Organizing Network, the staff coming from Los Angeles for this very, very special, very important event. But we have a very special guest now I'd like to introduce. She is Representative Dina Titus, who represents Congressional District 1, which we're in here in Congress. She's a career educator and public servant. She has taught as a professor of political science here at UNLV for 34 years and spent 20 years as a Nevada state senator. First elected to Congress in 2008. She now serves on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and the Veterans Affairs Committee. She's a great friend to UNLV and the Boyd School of Law, as well as workers and immigrants in Nevada. So please welcome Congresswoman Dina Titus.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Dean, for having me. It's always a pleasure to be back on campus. Lo siento, no hablo español muy bien. No poquito, no más. But I'm glad to be here, and I'm trying to get better. You are in the heart of the District 1. This is the heart of Las Vegas. It is the most ethnically diverse district in the state. We have a large Hispanic population, large Asian population. People from all over the world live here, and people from all over the world come here. So the work that you are doing, Chris, thank you, Chris, for bringing this program to us. And I want to first commend Boyd Law because it is always on the cutting edge when it comes to social justice issues. You have a real commitment to this community, and many of the programs you have here help my constituents outside of the classroom. And that's one of the things I brag about the most. And this is just another example of reaching out into the community and providing a service. In my district, we have also the largest number of undocumented people. It's about 8%. So services that are helpful to that community are very important, especially in these times when they're under such threat, where you have so much awful rhetoric coming from Washington, where things are not welcoming as the United States used to be, and so people are afraid to come out of the shadows to work, to play, to send their children to school in every way. So any assistance that can be provided, like this program, is really welcome. Of all the constituent services that we do in my district, probably helping on immigration issues is right at the top. Veterans and immigration, that's what we do the most. And we hear these stories that are just horror stories, especially from people who are in the day worker community. We hear stories like, well, we get paid less than other people on the job. We're often forced to give kickbacks in order to get the job. We don't have protections for health and safety through OSHA like some people have on the job. Sometimes we don't get paid at all, and there's nothing we can do about it. We don't get any kind of benefits like other people might get. And we are so afraid that if we make a mistake, they can not only throw us off the job, but who knows if ICE might not show up at the same time. Those are the kind of things that this law program will help with. I thank you, Professor, for being part of establishing it. The center that's going to be open to help day workers will be right in my district, over on Charleston and Eastern. So our office is right down the street. Please consider us a resource and let us know anything we can do to help. We want to be a partner. You are very important to us. We care very much about your future because your future is our future. The immigrant community brings with it not only economic success, but you're a part of our culture and our society. So please count on me to be that partner. And thank you to the law school and to all you're doing with the center. Arriba, right? So as I say, we just have to keep on. And no matter what we're facing. So, adelante, siguen adelante. Thank you very much.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Arriba Las Vegas, right? All right, I'm Al Soto. I'm the Workers' Rights Coordinator and Staff Attorney for the National Day Labor Organizing Network. And I'm here today from Los Angeles, where we're based. We work with worker centers and day labor organizations all across the country. Over 50 organizations representing workers, domestic workers, day laborers, low-wage workers, immigrant workers, that are trying to survive, trying to make their lives better, trying to improve their communities, and the worker centers are there to help them do that and to help create a core center place where they can actually meet and be safe and create that community and extend that community. So I'm really happy to be here today and happy to be helping to moderate and lead the discussion with these esteemed guests that we have here. So I'll jump right in. All the way on my left is the legal director of the National Day Labor Organizing Network, Chris Newman. And he has been representing and working shoulder to shoulder with day laborers, immigrant workers for over 15 years. Directly here to my left is Professor Michael Kagan, professor here at UNLV. He's the director of the Immigration Clinic, teaches immigration law among other areas, and his scholarship focuses on the intersections and diversions between U.S. civil rights and immigration legal frameworks. Immediately here on my right is Professor Ruben Garcia. He's the Associate Dean of Faculty Development and Research here, and he specializes as a professor in labor law. Previously practiced in Los Angeles, actually, where I'm from, representing unions and employees. In his first book, Marginal Workers, How Legal Fault Lines Divide Workers and Leave Them Without Protection, actually directly addresses the lack of protection for undocumented workers. And that was in 2012, so a lot of work there. All the way on our right is Professor Nick Theodore. He's an Associate Dean for Research and Faculty at the University of Illinois in Chicago. His work focuses on economic restructuring, labor standards, and worker organizing, and he's written extensively on the realities of working as an immigrant day laborer in the United States. Most recently producing a study on Las Vegas, and there's a bunch of copies of it outside, and hopefully you're all able to pick one up. And so I'm going to start with Professor Theodore to present some of the findings from that study.
Before we start, I was asked to give folks a reminder that there will be simultaneous translation during the day. And so if people are thinking really fast like this, you'll see the usual sign, slow down. If you're speaking really softly and nobody can hear you, you'll see the usual sign to speak up. So is that it, Blitz? Any other instructions? All right.
The okay sign.
The okay sign very well. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. Good morning to everybody. Day laborers in Las Vegas are primarily hired to, on an as-needed basis for temporary jobs in construction, landscaping, and moving. They're paid in cash, and their employment often is arranged hastily in a matter of seconds at one of Las Vegas's 18 informal hiring sites. What I wanted to do today is to summarize the results briefly, or most of the results, of the study we're releasing that looks at day labor conditions here in Las Vegas. I'll say really quickly what we did in terms of methodology, give you a couple top-line facts around day labor employment, but really want to drill in more on the question of wage theft and what happens out there on the street in these jobs. And then to finish up with a few comments around policing. So let's jump right in. In terms of methodology, we did a survey of 188 day laborers who were seeking work at informal hiring sites here in Las Vegas. These were in-person surveys that were administered in English and Spanish, and it's using a methodology that we found successful in Seattle, Houston, and in other places. The employment rate of day laborers in Vegas at the time we were surveying last year was about 49%. So about half of day laborers are going out to work on a daily basis, which is an indication that actually day labor demand is quite strong here in the Las Vegas area. Maybe a little hard to see this. We surveyed at the end of the month, so we probably overrepresented the moving jobs. About 37% of the jobs were moving, 31% were landscaping, and the rest were various construction-related activities. On average, the wages are not too bad. The average wage for moving jobs, for instance, was over $23. For construction, $17.50. Landscaping, $19, and so on. And so compared to a lot of day labor markets across the country, these average wages aren't too bad, but that's not the whole story. The problem is that many of these jobs only are for a few hours. And of course, that's part of the day labor economy. But in Vegas, we found that moving jobs, on average, were just for 3 hours. Landscaping jobs were just for 5 hours. Painting and cleanup jobs just for 6 hours. It was only construction and excavating jobs that had average hours of 8. So you can see that despite reasonable wages in many cases, the earnings at the end of the day for many workers are low. Of course, the earnings being low are compounded by the problem of wage theft. And wage theft is widespread here in the Las Vegas area. So wage theft, as you know, is a non-payment of work for work completed. We found that 1/3 of day laborers reported at least one instance of wage theft just in the last 2 months. The average amount was $223, and the maximum amount was $2,000. Now you may say, how can it be $2,000? And as I explain later on, I want to show how wage theft can often escalate from a day or two of work to much larger amounts. Employers use a range of tactics to violate employment laws. And wage theft often is accompanied by threats of retaliation, immigration-based retaliation. The U.S. immigration regime casts a long shadow over the day labor market, and unscrupulous employers often violate the law with impunity. What I'd like to do is to turn to a closer look at some of these tactics and to relay a little bit of what some of the day laborers here in Vegas told us about how wage theft occurs. You know, the most obvious form of wage theft is the outright refusal to pay workers their wages. The amounts may vary when this happens from a day to several days or more. In other cases, employers may refuse to pay workers the agreed upon wage, instead offering a lower amount. Workers may reluctantly accept that lower amount because they worry that if they fight too hard about it, they may be paid nothing at all. Luis, one worker here in town, told us, you make an agreement with someone looking to hire you. For example, you agree on $20 an hour, but they end up paying you $10 per hour. And they tell you because they know you don't have papers to work. Employers may also abandon day laborers at work sites, tell them that they can only pay with a personal check, which ends up bouncing. Claim that clients haven't paid for the work that's been completed, falsely tell workers that they're going to pay them the next day, and then of course they don't. 2 day laborers back in July accepted a job with a homeowner who had rented a truck at a U-Haul facility. They agreed to $120 for the move, and they jumped in the back of the truck and went off. They spent the morning fully loading a 27-foot truck with sofas and beds and boxes and so on. On the way to the second location, the employer stopped for gas. And while he was pumping the gas, he told the workers, run into McDonald's and get something to eat. Well, when they returned, the U-Haul was gone. As one of the workers explained, at first we waited in case he was coming back. After a while, it was clear he had left us there on purpose. I lost a whole day. I bet he went to another corner and did it all over again. A third tactic is evading responsibility for making payments. Rodolfo explains how he was denied for several days of work. He says, I felt like a soccer ball that the homeowner and the contractor were kicking back and forth. Also back in July, he was recruited from an informal hiring site in front of a Home Depot to remove and replace some tiling. After agreeing on the scope of the job with the contractor agreed to pay Rodolfo $1,500, plus expenses and materials. Rodolfo rented a jackhammer from Home Depot and started the job. After removing the tile, which was a full 2 days of work, the relationship between the contractor and the homeowner broke down. The contractor ended up leaving the job site and told Rodolfo just figure it out with the homeowner. The contractor told Rodolfo that the homeowner had refused to pay for the job, but when Rodolfo approached the homeowner for his wages, she told him that the contractor had already been paid. He goes on to say, she offered me $100 to leave, but I was owed $120 for the jackhammer rental alone. The value of work I completed was at least $500. When I pressed asking to be paid for my work, she threatened to call the police. I was furious that day but didn't react. I didn't want any problems, so I decided it would be better to lose my time and money rather than to end up in some kind of trouble. And I think these kind of quotes, whether it was the first one around you don't have papers, and this one with the implication of the danger that might come, sort of underscores that the power in this relationship often lies in the hands of employers. And with threats, either direct or maybe just a little bit hidden, but we all know what they mean. Those threats have real impact on the ability of workers to receive their pay. Another tactic is the false promise to pay later, and this is where I think we really get into a situation where wage theft amounts can become very great. In cases where wage theft occurs over several days, unpaid wages can rise from the hundreds and even into the thousands of dollars. It often occurs when employers start to make an initial payment, so they seem to be okay at first. They may pay the first day or so. But as the work proceeds, the pay is withheld. Day laborers return the following day with the expectation that the previous day's wages will be paid in full and that they'll be paid for the work that day. The longer this continues, though, the greater the amount of unpaid wages, and the more costly it becomes for a day laborer to walk away from that job, right? Because if they walk away from that job, they're going to lose the money that they've already invested. So under that kind of scenario, the day laborer is in a bind, either risk further accumulation of unpaid wages by continuing to work for the employer, or count whatever wages that weren't paid as a loss and simply walk away and look for some other job. But because day labor by definition is unstable, and because of the economic insecurity that most day laborers face, to say nothing about the illegality of this kind of move. Day laborers are reluctant, to say the least, to simply walk away from the work that they've done, even if this means that wage theft, that there's a possibility that wage theft will increase. So Francisco was employed by a construction contractor offering steady work. At first, he was paid daily and everything seemed fine. Then suddenly the contractor shifted and wanted to, from daily payments, and wanted to pay monthly. This continued until the final month, when the contractor failed to make the $4,000 wage payment. Francisco says, I went to the labor commissioner, and they told me that they couldn't help me. So I took him to small claim court, but he hired an attorney and I didn't. In the end, he offered me $800 of the $4,000 that he owed me. One more example, and that's the problem of requiring additional work. The survey didn't quantify these amounts, but it's clear that this is a widespread problem here in Las Vegas. 60% of the day laborers that we surveyed reported that while working in Vegas, they were required to do additional work without pay. Workers frequently feel compelled to perform work that's beyond the scope of the task that they were that was described to them, because they realize that if they refuse to do the extra work, they risk not being paid for the work completed. Jose accepted a job to move boxes between two locations in a FedEx store so they could be shipped. He agreed to load and unload the boxes, and he provided the use of his truck. To make a long story short, he followed the employer to several locations, loaded boxes and everything in the first truck. But when he arrived at the second location, the things weren't packed. So the employer said, "You've got to do this as well." He said, "I wasn't paid to do this." And the employer sort of pretended didn't understand and left. So he's sitting there, time is going on, he decides finally, all right, pack the boxes. And so he packs the boxes, they get hauled to the FedEx store. When they get to the FedEx store, the employees there say that the boxes have to be repacked. Again, you know, Jose said, "I wasn't paid to do this work." The employer holds up a $100 bill. "You want this?" And insisted that he repacked the job. But again, he wasn't paid to do that. He ended up leaving and was never paid. But to make matters worse, Jose, who's Honduran, reports, you know, he held up the $100 they agreed upon, but insisted that Jose repack the boxes. The employer responded by threatening to call immigration authorities to get Jose, who, as I said, is Honduran, deported back to Mexico. My sense is I'm running a bit short. I wanted to talk a little bit about policing. A couple of years ago, we did a large survey of 2,000 Latinos in 4 U.S. counties: Harris, which is Houston, LA County, Cook County, which is Chicago, and Maricopa County in Arizona. To make it quick, we wanted to know about Latinos' perception of the police in light of police involvement in federal immigration enforcement. Here in Las Vegas, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department has signed a memorandum of agreement, a 287G agreement with federal immigration authority, granting them immigration enforcement powers. And we asked a couple questions, and I just want to share these with you quickly. The first was, I'm less likely to contact police officers if I've been the victim of a crime, for fear that they'll ask me or other people I know about our immigration status. In our random sample of 2,000 Latinos in those 4 cities, 44% agreed with that question. We had a similar question. I'm less likely to voluntarily offer information about crimes I know have been committed because I'm afraid police officers will ask me or other people I know about our immigration status. Here again, 45% of Latinos agree with that statement. So we asked a similar question here in Las Vegas. Here are the studies of folks who are interested in seeing this in greater detail. But we asked a similar question here of day laborers. And we asked whether they were worried that if they report a crime to police officers would use this point of contact as an opportunity to look into and make an inquiry into the immigration status of that or someone they know. 47% of day laborers surveyed agreed, responded in the affirmative. And so I said at the beginning that the immigration regime casts a long shadow over day labor markets. And I think these kinds of questions point to a number of serious problems. The first is that the social distance between Latinos, between day laborers, and the police is growing. Right? There's a reluctance to see police, fear to see police as an ally. The second is that it doesn't just impact policing and public safety, as significant as that is. It also impacts the willingness and ability of day laborers to pursue wage recovery efforts, to pursue medical attention when they're injured on the job, to pursue other avenues of recourse when they have suffered violation. So the upshot of this whole story, I think, is that the day labor economy in Las Vegas is vibrant, but there are a number of deep problems within it, especially around wage theft. And this issue of policing in the city complicates matters and makes it very difficult for day labor independently to seek recourse for violations. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. And I'm sure everybody got their given these findings and I think Professor Theodore did a great job of covering the surface of what we found in that study, but definitely we're diving deeper into what's there. And we'd like to sort of now frame this framework of how labor law here in Las Vegas and throughout the country as well, but focusing here in Las Vegas, might be interacting with some of these specific issues that are facing day laborers and grid workers here on the ground in Las Vegas. And so I'd like to just continue backwards this way to Professor Garcia. Maybe you have commentary on that, what Professor Theodore said, and also just the general kind of overview of what you see going on here in Las Vegas.
Sure, and thanks again, Dr. Theodore, for being here and for this report. Really extremely helpful in terms of the context of what's happening in day labor in Las Vegas. I just want to make set the context in sort of three ways, of course, in terms of what what's like here in Nevada for those of you who are visiting from out of state. First, as I mentioned in the foreword that I wrote for this report, I think that we've had a very interesting paradox here in Nevada in terms of the strength of the labor movement, in terms of the Culinary Workers Union and the higher percentage of workers in unions on the Strip, and the higher percentage state to state of workers in unions, and yet we have a very large informal economy, right? We have a very definite approach of sort of right to work and rugged individualism in terms of the informal economy and individual workers. So that's the context in which a lot of these abuses that you're talking about sits, right? And so that's we've seen, and obviously we can talk about ways in which labor, organized labor, can support the informal economy. But again, I'm sure that that's something that will be discussed soon in this city. Second thing that the report brings up, of course, is that the labor commissioner, many of these workers did go to the labor commissioner, right? And they did seek redress from the labor commissioner here in Nevada. And it speaks, I think, to the kind of thin administrative state that we have here in comparison to our neighbors to the west, California or other large states, right? So we have, again, a kind of a system that really prioritizes individual enforcement, and yet, until just recently, it wasn't clear whether there was an individual right of action in Nevada to enforce paid wages, right? It was just in December of 2017 where the Nevada Supreme Court in the Neville case held that there is a private right of action, and the labor commissioner is not the sole remedy. So that is, again, a context point here that I think will be very important going forward in the work that's going on in terms of the center and in terms of other worker justice movements here in Las Vegas. And third thing, again, is just in terms of the political context that we're sitting in now here in Nevada. As you know, we're in the midst of a debate on immigration policy nationally, and that, as Congresswoman Titus said, certainly touches us here quite directly in Nevada because of the large immigrant population that we have. But in the end, again, we have to remember the legislative session cycle means that we don't get a lot of protections for workers in the interim between the 2017 legislative session and the 2019 legislative session. So we have, in the last session, there were moves to raise the minimum wage, there were moves to provide treble damages for wage theft, and both of those bills died in the 2017 session controlled by Democrats. Right? So the question again comes back to how do workers, particularly non-union workers, individual workers, and non-citizen workers, and I, in my book again talk about their status as marginal workers, basically not just marginalized by the law, but also by the political system, right? So being unable to change the laws for their own benefit, for the better protection of themselves and for other workers. And I think, again, that dynamic is at play here and will continue to be in play here. But the thing about the Workers' Center, the opening of the Worker Center here is that it really becomes part of the National Worker Center movement. These Worker Centers, as many of you know, are not focused just upon recovering unpaid wages for workers or improving health and safety, as this report details. These are clearly needs here in Las Vegas and will continue to be as the economy increases and as more informal work opportunities arise. So what we have then is a question of building political power out of these worker centers, as many have done throughout the country, right? And particularly when you're talking about non-citizen workers and how they leverage political power with other civil society actors, I think, again, the time is right for attention to these kinds of issues at the legislative level. And I think, again, that's usually been done, at least historically and throughout the country, in terms of the worker center movement. And so again, I think this is a critically important report, and it's very timely. And obviously the opening of the Worker Center is a very timely event indeed as well. So I can leave it there and say please let us.
Thank you for that perspective. I'll inject a little bit of my own perspective. In California, we recently did pass a higher minimum wage with treble damages for minimum wage enforcement. Specifically in Pasadena, one of the cities, and I think we have some members here who could speak on this, were instrumental, the Worker Center in Pasadena and Jornaleros there, in actually pushing for that change by bringing themselves and their voices and their families to City Hall, and pushing for that in Los Angeles, Pasadena. And that's something that the Worker Center can play a huge role in building that base power and showing that there is a need and that there are people in those communities that will count. So I want to move to my left now to Professor Keegan. I know your work tracks closer, and I'm getting this, I'm going to slow down. Your work tracks closer to broader constitutional issues. But you do have a theme, I think, in what I've seen at least, in sort of the gaps, whether you're talking about the Fourth Amendment, whether you're talking about the literal appellate removal decisions, where there seems to be a kind of gap in where the law speaks directly to this population of immigrant workers and documented workers. And so in the broader context of Las Vegas, of United States immigrant workers having access to courts, having access to labor protections, I'm wondering bringing your perspective and from the perspective of immigration law, how you see that can speak to these issues that we're bringing up today in Las Vegas and throughout the country where they
Thank you very much. Let me actually just start at the following on what Ruben just talked about in terms of developing political power with an observation and also why I think the establishment of the Worker Center is really important and I hope part of something larger. I've been here in Las Vegas going on 7 years, and one of the things I've noticed here in Nevada generally, because of Nevada politics, because we're a swing state, there's a tremendous amount of energy and resources devoted to political mobilization, to voter registration, citizenship drives which are often quite consciously tied in with voter registration, and that's all extremely important. I think we can see how much it matters who actually wins elections. But I have not seen that energy necessarily matched in developing institutions that help people solve the problems in their daily lives. And I think the Worker Center is very part about this. Part of this, I think Melissa has been, she hasn't been here very long, but it seems, I think, longer than it really is on the calendar. I think it's become a fixture, I think, in work in the community here. And I think more on a larger level, I hope it's part of an additional piece that we've largely been missing in Southern Nevada, which is developing institutions. Not spokespeople, political activism, politicians who get elected are important, but having institutions that people can turn to help to address the problems that they face every day is something that we have to do a lot more work on in Nevada. I'm sure nationally as well. Whenever I was in California, it always looked like, wow, it would be great if there were some organizations like that here, and in this case, fortunately we have one. Regarding immigration, the role of immigration actually on the topic of day labor is really quite interesting because in a sense, it would be entirely correct to say this is not an immigration issue. Because when it comes to regulating or protecting workers and labor rights, immigration really shouldn't be actually the main factor. But it would probably also be wrong to say immigration is not the issue. I think as the study says, 94% of day laborers in the study are immigrants. And generally speaking, what we see is that immigration concerns can infect other areas of law enforcement and other social services. And that, I think, will be the theme that I'll try to address here. Immigration confuses people, both the victims and the people who could help at the front lines. And that's really important, especially in a situation where we have weaker worker protection for citizens than we might. So for people to be marginalized even from those protections is really quite damaging. In immigration, this is something that surprises people usually when I talk about immigration law. Employment is surprisingly peripheral in immigration. It's a key benefit. Obviously, it's what, and everyone knows at a policy level it's extremely important, but the way immigration law is structured, immigration regulates entry and presence, and the right to employment authorization, the employment authorization card that our clients get, is that it's treated essentially by the law and by the government as a side benefit that grows from something else. It's not, people will often say, well, I have a work permit, and they'll think that's an immigration status. It's not. In fact, you can have employment authorization without having an actual immigration status in certain circumstances. Congress has decided, in theory, this is the theory, that they want to have employer-side sanctions. So the idea was that the enforcement should actually target the employers, not the workers. That's never really worked out and never really been followed through on correctly in terms of enforcement. Typically, when you have workplace raids, they haul away the workers, not the employer. But the I-9 form that people fill out when they get jobs is supposed to be an obligation of the employer. It's actually not specifically criminal or prohibited to seek work as long as one doesn't commit fraud. It can be a problem later on if someone is applying for immigration status, but it's not strictly illegal for someone to actually seek work. It's also not secret. In fact, there's a potential opening in the law for undocumented immigrants to own their own businesses and to be independent consultants, which is an arrangement that some industries use to exploit workers. And so I'm not really saying that it's a great scenario, but it's an example of the way in which immigration law does not actually restrict economic activity nearly as much as people really think it does. The I-9 form, though, is an interesting index of where there are real gaps here and where more enforcement at the local level would be really useful. The I-9 form that people who get, like I had to fill one out to get a job at UNLV, is designed for people who become sort of standard wage earning employees. It's not required for casual domestic work, sporadic, irregular, intermittent work. That's USCIS's words, and obviously that's day labor. Also, it's not required for when someone is being hired through a contractor. So a typical case, I think what we heard about that leads to some of these wage disputes is where a homeowner hires a contractor to do some type of project at their house, and the homeowner has a relationship with the contractor, who may be an American citizen, and then that contractor hires workers of a different status. The homeowner would not have to fill out the I-9 form. In fact, a few years ago, in the 2012 election, this happened as a minor scandal with Mitt Romney, because he had done this with the landscaping company. But that actually points to a really interesting issue that I think probably could use some attention. The role of contractors. If you go to Las Vegas Justice Court at the Regional Justice Center any morning, you will see mostly Latino men being prosecuted for something called doing business without a license. This typically means that they were advertising their work typically on Craigslist, to do things, especially drywall work, and will be prosecuted by the contractors board for not having a proper license. This is the requirement to have a contractor's license is aggressively enforced here because there's money involved and because contractors want to be paid well for having the contractor's license. And they don't like being undercut by people without it. So while there is aggressive enforcement in that area, there's not much enforcement when a contractor hires a worker and then doesn't pay. Very little enforcement. There's a real inequality in those two areas. Because of doubts that people have about whether immigrants are allowed to work, we have two problems on two ends. I don't know if you wrap up. But on the one end, as we heard, the workers may be afraid to seek help. And that's one problem. And on the other side, people who could help may be confused. And we see this, something strange about immigration and the effect it has in the mind. The Department of Justice says that immigration is a civil matter, but then often it's treated as if it was a matter of a high crime. If I were being audited by the IRS, I would not worry that Las Vegas Metro Police would treat me differently during a traffic stop. But when immigration is an issue, which is also a civil matter, people have to worry about that intensely. And the police, unfortunately, send very mixed messages about what one should expect in that interaction. This is why we really need it for the labor market and for many other areas for immigration to be treated as just immigration on the side. Much as if I have a dispute with the IRS or a dispute with my HOA or any of the other things that people have here. And we actually have a number of laws that people should be able to enforce. If I go to get my haircut at Supercuts and don't pay, that's theft of services, it's a crime. But when it comes to this area of work, quite often the people who could be doing something about it will find themselves confused, not sure, I don't know what the immigration issues, can I address this? And then that is what allows people to be exploited.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm sure there'll be more questions. I want to just leave some time to make sure we have some questions at the end here. So Chris, can you bring us home and give us a national picture of that?
Well, it's great to be here, particularly great because I got my start as a law student helping out in the Labor Worker Center when I was in law school 15 years ago. I'm looking at you because I speak quickly, so I'll try to remind myself to speak slowly. It's also great to be part of a good day in otherwise really dark times. Today is a really great day here in Vegas, and it's a reminder that big things are possible, even despite the awful stuff that we see in Washington, D.C. And it's also a reminder that the powerlessness that we feel at the federal level can be responded to, and that we actually have power and responsibility to build community at the local level, and build strength at the local level, and that's clearly a theme that has emerged in these panels. Congress might be broken, our politics might be poisoned by racism and xenophobia, the courts might have, unfortunately, certainly the Supreme Court, altered this composition in a very negative way. And we clearly have an overtly racist president. But at the local level, sort of fear against reality, and worker centers have a way of entering into sort of the reality that we've discussed in a way that acts in stark sort of contrast to the dysfunction of Washington, D.C. Whereas things don't work in Washington, D.C., worker centers, day labor centers, find a way to make things work, even in the worst of all circumstances. And so it's fitting, I think, today that we are talking or opening this day labor center the day after Trump put forth his new quote-unquote immigration framework, because the day labor center itself is not just a resistance of that framework, it's also a blueprint of how we're going to overcome the white nationalism that undergirds the Trump proposal. And I know that might be a potentially incendiary thing to say, to accuse the White House of overt white nationalism, but I think it is fair at this point to say that that's exactly what has happened. Sensing an advantage from the government shutdown, the White House has now amplified its public demands. It no longer is the case that they're trying to hold dreamers hostage for the exchange for a wall, which is what they were debating previously sort of defined by. The White House has now injected two new proposals or sort of ransom demands for dreamer legalization that have nothing to do with dreamer legalization. The first has to do with trying to destroy a bedrock principle of U.S. Immigration law, namely that we base our policy on family reunification. And the second has to do with this idea of inserting a meritocracy as a precondition to entering the United States. And the thing is that what they're trying to do, I think, in terms of the meritocracy, getting rid of the required sort of points to come in, is they want people who come in starting at the top. They want people who come in with wealth, and that's the opposite of sort of what the country has been built on. The idea that you can come from the bottom and build your way up. And worker centers, I think, are part of that. Worker centers are also a reaction to the other goal of the White House if the proposal fails, which is namely imposing attrition and denying services to immigrants so that they voluntarily self-deport. Remember, for the white nationalists who are now occupying the White House, they don't need to pass legislation to continue their plan to immiserate immigrants. Their plan is to deny foreign-born populations in the United States access to jobs, education, and services, and to redress whenever their rights are violated as a means of making life so miserable that immigrants and their families decide to leave the United States. And so in the face of that goal of trying to immiserate and make difficult life, daily labor centers themselves, just by their sheer existence, become a response to that, a repudiation of that. Some people have wrote that they're labor sanctuaries, but they're places where people can get jobs and people can exercise their rights and also express political circumstances or political desires as well. And our theory at Englon for years, since we founded it, was not only just that a rising tide lifts all boats, but the idea is that by making injustice visible, we're able to sort of bring a transformative approach. And so this year, when we had our National Day Labor Organizing Conference that some of you all were at, the theory, or the name of the conference was Courage Over Fear. And in the face of Donald Trump's effort to infect the country with fear, to try to make people afraid of immigrants, day laborers every day when they see work on the corner express courage, and the kind of courage that Donald Trump can only dream that he had himself. And so having an institution that allows both the making visible of the injustice, the robbing of wages, the attrition against day laborers, but also sort of elevating the courage of day laborers. From right here in Vegas, we're going to be able to do things, I think, that turn the tide on what Donald Trump is proposing. And I want to share 3 examples of how we've done that in the past, and how we've taken crisis moments and turned them into opportunity. The first was in a campaign that we had to fight against the criminalization of day labor. We're lucky today that we have Tom Simons, the president, the general counsel of Maldives, who will be speaking later. He, along with Pablo, the director of Englon, were involved in over a decade-long campaign to defeat ordinances that made it a crime, literally made it a crime, to look for work in public spaces. And over a course of years with law and organizing, day laborers' rights were finally vindicated in federal courts, upholding their First Amendment right to seek work in public spaces. And in the process of vindicating those First Amendment rights of day laborers, we removed a tool from cities across the country that sought as well to criminalize day labor, and that was able to open the space, if you will, for the day labor center worker movement to grow and thrive. Cities could not, even if they wanted to, arrest day laborers because of threat of litigation, and instead they were incentivized to open centers like the Ariba Center where policies of inclusion would be given a chance to win. Another example where a crisis was really turned into an opportunity was in Phoenix, Arizona. The campaign against 287G, program that most people know about, was actually started at Day Labor Corner in Phoenix in 2007 by a day laborer named Don Marcelino. And I couldn't remember his whole name, but it was day laborers in Phoenix that were the first in Phoenix to actually stand up against Joe Arpaio. In 2007, Joe Arpaio was terrorizing immigrants. He enjoyed an 85% approval rating in Phoenix. It's kind of hard to believe. It's astronomical. He had an 80. You can imagine what life would be like if Trump enjoyed such an approval rating. An 85% approval rating in the 5th or 4th largest county in the United States. There were no elected officials that stood up to him. He was, in every way, a tyrant, reigning over a sort of lawless sheriff's department and scapegoating immigrants. And it was day laborers who stood up to him at first and boycotted a furniture store where he had strong ties to, and eventually enlisted the participation of people all throughout the city and all throughout the country. And 10 years later, the same election that brought us Donald Trump, unfortunately, nationally, was the same election in which Joe Arpaio was ultimately voted out of office after having lost several lawsuits, civil rights lawsuits, in fact himself being convicted of criminal violation. He was finally voted out of office, and that campaign was quite literally started at a day labor street corner in Phoenix. And it wasn't just the victory that occurred in Phoenix that was caused by the fight and the resistance that was put up in Phoenix. What we now consider to be the sort of modern sanctuary city debate owes as well its existence to the fight that was put up in Arizona by people responding to the type of over white nationalist racism that we're now seeing from the White House. And so, for example, cities that chose to try to opt out of immigration enforcement and to resist against then President Obama's secure communities program were inspired precisely by a desire to not replicate the injustice that was made visible in Phoenix. And so I was fortunate enough to be in Washington, D.C. When for the first time in the country, a city council voted to try to opt out of the Secure Communities program, and the city council members there were chanting "No More Arizonas" as they passed they passed a law that was eventually superseded, seeking to opt out of immigration enforcement. And so it was the fighting back that opened up the space for more productive, inclusive policies around the country, including policies like the California Trust Act and the California Values Act, which are now coming under threat from the Trump administration. The third example I'll give you of a crisis turning into a major opportunity led by the labor worker centers happened after the 2006 Sensenbrenner bill. So many, or 2005 Sensenbrenner bill. So many of you remember that in December of 2005, the most anti-immigrant congressional legislation, at least in my lifetime, passed out of the United States House, which then resulted in 2006 in millions of people marching in resistance to stop and block that bill. Among the things that were included in that really awful bill, which in many ways portended and sort of foreshadowed the moment that we're in now and foreshadowed, unfortunately, what happened in Arizona. Among the provisions that were in that bill were very specific provisions to make criminal day labor worker centers. Quite literally imposing criminal penalties for people using the same theory that we're now hearing from the ICE director, that there's unlawful harboring, unlawful providing assistance to people who are perceived to be undocumented. That bill required day labor centers to verify immigration status, to alter the sort of employer-based, asymmetrical enforcement that we've heard about. And our entire network faced what was an existential crisis. Had that law been been signed, had it been a proposal been turned into law, we would all be ourselves criminalized. And so then, only 4 years old, the National Day Labor Organizing Network engaged in its first ever federal lobbying effort. And the first thing that we were told by Speaker Pelosi's chief of staff was that unless we came back to Washington, D.C. with the support of unions, we would eventually lose the fight. Maybe the Sensenbrenner bill would not be signed into law that year, but eventually, if we did not come back with the support and political support of unions, we would eventually be in trouble. And so out of that crisis was born what became the 2006 AFL-CIO Worker Center agreement. We endeavored to meet with some of the more progressive voices within the AFL-CIO, who were then at that time battling, actually, there was a sort of fight for the soul of the labor movement, and several of the most pro-immigrant unions had left the AFL-CIO to start Change to Win. Then at the top of the AFL-CIO, there was incredibly progressive leadership, including John Hyatt, John Sweeney, then the director, the president of the AFL, and Anna Avendano in particular, who worked at the General Counsel's office. And a partnership agreement was formed between the Day Labor Worker Centers and the AFL-CIO, which was used to basically put to rest the threat of the criminalization of Day Labor Worker Centers, which then yielded a whole number of other things that allowed for subsequent partnerships between worker centers and the labor movement to take place, and subsequent partnerships to take place at the local level, the kinds of things that we are looking forward to doing here in Las Vegas. I imagine, like everywhere in the country, there is incredible division in Las Vegas about Donald Trump, about sort of the symbolic importance of some of his awful proposals. Might be division about whether there should be legalization, might be division about whether there should be the construction of a wall. And that type of division has had incredibly dangerous consequences at the federal level. It's preventing U.S. Congress from fulfilling its constitutional obligation to update immigration laws, and it's also poisoning our politics. But here in Vegas, we have the opportunity to establish a consensus, because whether you disagree or agree about the wall, and hopefully we all disagree that we should be doing well, we can all agree that employers should not steal wages from people. We should all agree that you should put scofflaw and predatory employers out of business. And so even as we see all of this sort of awful stuff happening at the federal level, there's an opportunity that now exists here in Nevada to build upon a consensus that strengthens bonds within community and strengthens our commitment to bedrock labor protections and civil rights protections and the like. And so I'm super excited to be here, and I'm super excited for the rest of the day. I know that both Pablo and Tom will be speaking about the actual event, and I'm really excited to accompany everyone in Las Vegas in the work that lies ahead.
Before I open it up for questions, and I hope people in the audience are thinking about questions, what they'd like to ask our panel. I want to pause there. So yeah, I think that we have definitely hammered home, and I hope that now the gravity of this moment isn't lost on people, that we're opening an immigrant worker center, a day labor worker center, that the workers here are organizing in the midst of the most anti-immigrant government that maybe that we've ever had in the history of the United States. In a moment when they're trying to make it so horrifying and so stressful to be an immigrant worker in this country that, like Chris said, that they just sort of give up and leave. Instead, against that fear, workers are standing up, immigrants are standing up and joining together to fight against that. So, and that's, I think, why we're saying, I don't know about Las Vegas, right? We're building up this community. We're not bowing down. So I want to pause there, though, so it's great we have a worker center. Now, let's talk about the work plan for the next couple of years. And this is the important part, the practical thing. And so it was mentioned briefly, some of the ideas that have been successful in other worker centers. And Professor Garcia, you talked briefly about travel damages and minimum wage laws here in the state of Nevada and Las Vegas. So I want to ask our panel, and maybe this goes directly to our to Nevadans here that are on the panel, what specifically can you see this worker center, these workers coming together and really trying to coalesce a coalition here in Las Vegas or in Nevada to actually push specific gains and to improve the state of workers and workers here in Las Vegas and Nevada. So I open that up to you all, the panel, anybody who wants to jump in and start to brainstorm with folks here in the room, with Liz and folks to talk about, well, how can we actually now start to use this organized group of workers to make gains and to push against what we're seeing. So, who wants to?
Well, I think again, as I said, there are certainly mechanisms. You can look in other states for comparative mechanisms to enforce wages, wage boards, and more government involvement basically than we're used to in Nevada for that kind of protection of workers. Again, you have this kind of activity going on in New York, California, the wage boards being set up, and work centers have been critical in that. The construction of those processes there. But as the report details, there's, even for the existing mechanisms, there's a lack of funding, there's understaffing, there's under-resourcing, and which is not something we're unfamiliar with here in Nevada, right? So it is, as we go ahead, we have to look at, first of all, starting with the baseline of what we have, and enforcing that, right? And then other kinds of innovations like double damages or, clear sort of attorney's fee shifting for these individual cases, access to justice issues in terms of, as the report indicates, that even if you have a small claim, there's, as we saw in the report, there was an imbalance between workers who were unrepresented and employers that were represented. So there's just a lot of basics here, of course, that we can start with in terms of the minimum, and then start talking again about more innovations. But again, I think this report is very important in terms of its laying out these instances, and as we look at the next year, in terms of the growing economy, growing revenue from sources like marijuana, what is the dividend of that to the actual infrastructure that we have here already in place in that.
And travel damages, I said it much and sort of skipped over it, right? That's you receive 3 times, right, the damages that you would just based on the restitution, based on what you lost as wages, right?
Right, 3 times the unpaid wages.
And so it's a higher penalty on employers who are.
Yes. And again, those kind of penalties are great, but as we know, there's an issue of even finding off of these employers. Wage garnishment statutes also, again, there's a lot of minimum infrastructure, I think, in terms of actually finding a lot of these unscrupulous employers to begin with, right? And that's why, again, it's really, that's I think where the book starts.
Professor Katie, if you want to comment on that or comment on.
I think, we often, as I was mentioning about political mobilization, a lot of these things are often dealt with at a very superficial level, and there can be good intentions expressed there, but it's much harder to have people accountable to good intentions. I think, and I'll mention some things I know that the Worker Center has already been dealing with, that our police often say some things that are encouraging about we don't want to enforce immigration law in the field, and yet it's frequent to hear about people who are asked by police officers about their immigration status. It's hard to sometimes figure out, and there are not always the infrastructure to find out what's going on in these cases. So having a place where people can go to report that, and then someone who knows how to follow up on it is essential. It doesn't always have to lead to a major piece of litigation. Sometimes police officers make mistakes, and if the department handles it appropriately, then that's actually what you want to have. But it's too easy for people to make surface level statements that sound okay when no one is there on the ground to listen to someone who might be experiencing something different.
I would say, when it comes to the issue of wage that I myself have done, quite literally, I've worked on hundreds of cases of people who have been deprived of wages. And it's very important to seek changes to the law. So really, in the end, there's three things that I think are the most important. The first is prevention, the second is deterrence, and then the third, frankly, is extra-legal, outside of the law action. And so on the prevention side, Professor Theodore noted that the worst of all cases become kind of like a quicksand where people get in so deep that they can't get out, and they keep working with the false hope that they're going to eventually get their large sum of money. And the most important thing is to know that if you haven't been paid on your first day, the first time the employer says no, you stop working and you cut your losses there. The second thing that's really important, again, is to have some deterrence, because these predatory employers, it's a lot like shoplifting. Every time they get away with it, they're more incentivized to do it the next time. And so in that sense, every single time somebody exposes or fights back against a predatory employer, they're preventing the next case, the next victim. And then the third thing, and again, and this is what will ultimately, I can assure you, when you look at the changes in the law, whether it's increasing penalty, there's a number of different directions that we can go into in terms of increasing penalties, thinking about ways to have collection. But action that happens outside of the law, unfortunately, is the best intervention now. And that involves, for example, protesting employers at their homes, at their churches, doing it with the media, bringing the police if necessary to help engage in shaming tactics against employers, because that is a way of, again, raising the profile of the issue. It's a way of shaming people. And again, in an ideal world, nonprofit organizations and people in their volunteer spare time would not do that type of thing. It would be a core government function that would be fulfilled. But in the absence of that, that type of mobilization and solidarity makes things visible, and ultimately opens the possibility for whatever policy changes might come down the road.
Yeah, we say día trabajado.
Yeah.
Yeah, how about centering it, before I open up the questions, another idea that I just thought of is here at UNLV Law School, right? There could even be lots of partnerships between the immigrant rights clinic and certain cases, or the workers' rights. Is there workers' rights clinic? Workplace law program. Yeah. Can work together with the clinic. We've seen some great clinic partnerships in law school. Partnerships. All right, so I hope you're ready. We have some time for questions. So, pitching it to the audience, who here has a question for our panel? Raise your hand and we'll make sure that the panel can hear you or interpret it.
Jokes too.
Yeah.
Good jokes, I'm sure of that.
Si quieres ya te pongo traducir.
Can I, he wants to say something in Spanish.
Sí.
Sí. Sí?
That's all right. So, okay, so we'll give people another couple minutes to think about questions. Quien también si tiene pregunta en español, nosotros traducir. Right? Okay, so we talked about a little bit of the practical legislative gains that might be made. I think that also Chris brings up at the end of when we were going through here this really important idea that worker centers play this key role, I would say extrajudicial role, in terms of creating that community pressure, specifically in wage cases we were talking about. But I'm imagining now that from a broad perspective, I mean, you brought up Ed Phoenix with Sheriff Arpaio a little out. But there was a lot of that type of worker organizing that happened around that time to actually create the pressure. So I'm wondering if Chris or Nick or anybody here on the panel wants to talk about kind of how you fashion, a growing campaign of local workers, local immigrant workers that starts, right here. It starts with just the opening of the center. How can you envision that becoming something that can have the impact of voting out a Sheriff Arpaio, changing the minimum wage laws of the state, making a sanctuary state? I think it's a great example of that as well. Like, how do you see that happening? I think it's hard sometimes from the beginning of something, the beginning of just the nascent form, to see, well, how can we ever get to, like in the state of California, as California. So how do you envision that organizing growing, and how does that organizing look in practice for people who have never really seen that, like wage step organizing or immigrant rights organizing in a sense?
Let me start. So, the Worker Center is opening here in Las Vegas today. But for your average Las Vegas resident, they may drive by informal hiring sites. They may see workers getting picked up for work, but they actually know, unless they're an employer, they actually know very little about the day labor economy. I think one of the nice things about opening the center, as Chris was saying, is that it becomes this platform for a lot of different activities, for direct action when workers are not paid, for working together to move the labor commissioner and other government officials to address problems, to shape public opinion through the media and explanations of what this is, and ultimately to press for policy change, as Chris was saying. But I want to talk about this shaping of public opinion, because what the Worker Center allows day laborers to do is to have that platform to explain to other residents of Vegas what's going on. And what we've seen in city after city across this country, when that work is done, when those stories make it into the media, when the workers speak for themselves about these conditions, people are moved. And they say, I never really knew what was happening there, but I can't believe it's this bad. Or I can't believe these problems are allowed to exist. And it starts to shape the political culture, even in an environment like today. I think the sense of folks' sense of injustice, I think, is moved when workers organize to try to lay out those conditions. And so I want to talk about the early days, because I think Chris can talk about what happens after that. But it's an opportunity to move people from where they were to educate people about what's happening so that future action can occur.
To me, it's about galvanizing resources, and I think it's appropriate to start off having a meeting among day laborers in the law school, because the law school itself is a resource, and it's a way to bring people and bring resources to bear. To me, the Day Labor Center, more than anything, are kind of vehicles in which people who share, in at least today's political parlance, a vision that is different from that vision being expressed by Donald Trump. It's a vehicle through which those kinds of connections can be forged. And in my own experience, I would be interested to share. When I was a law student, we were able to literally use the law school to help subsidize the creation of the Day Labor Center and the enlist participation of other actors, whether it was churches, whether it was police, whether it was unions, other institutions. And so, this is the starting of creating a vehicle or an institution by which people who share a more inclusive view, certainly a less fearful view of immigration than those in Washington, D.C. can get together and make their ideas a reality. And again, it's a way where new ideas that might be totally sort of infeasible at the federal level can be accomplished at the local level. Whereas again, we are individually sort of powerless to do anything, unfortunately, at this moment to change what's going to happen tomorrow from the White House or fix the broken Congress, a few of us really get together and come up with proposals or ideas and mobilize them that are in fact big and ambitious, and you can make them happen, and then you know, hopefully serve as an example for other municipalities and other lawmakers. So, you know, to me that's the biggest promise. And it does start off, it's organizing. It starts off with this is a pretty great group to start off with, and it can only grow from here.
Yeah, just add to that. I just want to add to that in terms of the centrality of the law school here to that, what Chris is talking about. You know, a couple months ago in this room, we had the opening of our Bernstein and Associates Children's Rights Clinic and for unaccompanied immigrant minors. And the law school, particularly the immigration clinic, many people here have been instrumental in the DACA renewal process. Students have been involved in that process over the last several months. So as Chris was saying, in this kind of particular moment, we're seeing kind of these kinds of efforts really intensifying, right? And I think it's, again, it's a matter of the narrative that Nick was talking about in terms of, you know, these workers, you know, just like the narratives of those children that were so powerfully delivered here a few months ago. I think we also can similarly talk about the narratives of workers and see it, you know, for people to realize that, again, it is about a human rights story, about a workers' rights story. And so those are the kinds of things I think that this center will be particularly good to do.
All right, I'm going to open it up one more time. If there's any questions from the audience, questions from
Here, a question. I would like to know, just in case I'm doing a job site for a person in town, what should I do? She said they call cops. You will show up. What is my life? What I need to do? I mean, I think everybody's okay. Somebody called cop after you finish your job. You're supposed to get paid, but the owner say, I'm not going to pay you. I'm going to call cops. What about the cops show up? What my rights and what should I do?
This speaks to the real fear people have.
Yeah, that's the fear we have actually.
So it's hard to give a simple answer, and honestly, that's when I talk to the police, that's one of the complaints that I have. Is that, well, actually, I'm able to be charitable, but I think their intentions are often good. It's hard to just give you a black and white answer. Being at a work site is not a crime, and so you should not have to worry about the police coming. Just say if you're afraid for immigration reasons or anything else. In theory, the Las Vegas Metro, if they were here, I think would say that their officers are not supposed to enforce immigration law in the field. That's what they say. And generally speaking, you know, I think we're always watching, and I am being very careful here because I don't have 100% confidence that that's followed 100% of the time. I think I can say confidently that it's not the Joe Arpaio situation. It's not a systemic sort of intentional, we're going to go after immigrants policy. So generally speaking, we advise our clients in most cases that if you are a victim of crime or if you've committed a crime, you should not inherently be afraid of calling the police. And if you haven't paid, you could call the police and say they've stolen my services. Now, it may be a good idea, and I don't know how things work, and so I'm on a panel like this, I don't want to speak for other people. I think it's helpful to have allies when you're doing that, so that you're confident talking to the police and know where you stand and get advice before doing that. And that's the kind of infrastructure and an institution that I hope we can have here. But in theory, someone who's worked and has been promised under a contract that they'll be paid for it should not have to fear the police. And it's one of the problems that we have, that people think that immigrants are fair game and easy to exploit for that reason.
I was going to say, because sometimes I'm like, we like to say we fear it.
Yeah.
Sometimes when they're cops, when you're with the cops, sometimes they react different. And you see a lot of cases like that.
Right.
I don't know, I know there's a law, you have to respect that. You all know that. Sometimes like they take advantage for your immigration status, even if you have no papers. There's sometimes you're afraid like they're gonna take it and they report it back to the bank.
That's right.
That's the fear that we have actually.
What I can tell you is that Metro spokespeople say over and over and over again, our officers are not supposed to enforce immigration in the field. Now, that, again, but I don't want to pretend that there are no problems, because there are certainly officers who violate that and other guidelines in the field sometimes. And the other thing that can come up, to be frank, you sir obviously speak English, but you know, when someone calls 911, the officer who arrives may not speak Spanish, and so and the person who's able to communicate with the officer obviously has an advantage. I don't want to pretend that there are no problems here, but I also would like to say that people probably have more sometimes do not have to feel as afraid as they do.
Let's say example, what about if they take me, just in case? What is my right? Should I stay quiet, hire a lawyer, or what?
Stay quiet.
Should I have to say my name and have to say everything to the cops?
Here's the most important thing.
Not just.
I'll tell you, I mean, it's hard to, you know, it's very difficult to move from sort of the theory of what your rights are to the reality of being confronted with an interaction with the police. The first thing is obviously to try to learn as much as you can about what rights you do in fact have. Then again, whether there's a policy or not, you might have a bad apple police officer who is in fact violating the rights. I would say the single most important thing for people to know is to remember the question, am I being detained or am I free to leave? And that's a question that carries a legal significance, because if the police does not have a lawful basis to detain you, everything that potentially happens afterward might be sort of, you know, if down the road you're able to have a lawyer, you might be able to sort of eliminate evidence that gets received. And so that's a question that almost every police officer in America is trained, and they know when someone's asking that question, that person sort of knows their rights. And if they don't have a lawful basis to detain you, they have to say, you know, you're free to leave and you should walk away. They have all kinds of techniques to try to intimidate you and make you think that you're being detained. Now, again, your rights might still be violated. And I want to share a story of a day laborer who was a client of ours at Milan named Jose Ucella. This is a quintessential story, and it also illustrates the point that I was trying to make, at least in my presentation. Jose is a day laborer from Orange County. He worked for a day painting concrete. At the end of the day, he was supposed to be paid $100 by his employer. And his employer, he went to go ask for the money, and the employer said, not only am I not going to pay you $100 that I owe you after you've just literally been working your ass off all day painting concrete in Orange County, I'm going to call the cops and say that you were robbing me. They both call 911 at the same time. The employer and also Jose, saying, this guy's crazy. Cops arrived on the scene. None of them spoke Spanish. Jose knew his rights. He was detained and brought into police custody unlawfully. And by the time they were able to, in the Anaheim Police Department, get the facts right, they realized, okay, your story, Jose, checks out. This employer was in fact, robbing your wages and engaging in all kinds of, predatory to call police. By the time that happened, okay, so that's the good news is we realize you're not robbing this guy. The bad news is we're detaining you because of suspicion that you're in the country unlawfully. So he was illegally detained. This is back in the infancy of the security release program. And he was now behind bars and having been wronged doubly, first by the employer, then by the police. His sister got on the phone and started calling Univision, Telemundo, calling any of her friends to fight back. We got a call from Univision. We got put in touch with Jose because his sister fought back. We went and visited him behind bars, undertook representation, eventually got him out, eventually got him paid, eventually got him a green card. It's a long story to all of that. And in the end, Jose was one of the people who testified in Sacramento for the California Trust Act a bill to prevent that type of circumstance from happening again. So the first thing is obviously to prevent and do what you can to prevent the police from violating your rights. But then when you know that the police is violating your rights, it doesn't end there. You can fight back. And in that case, literally the thing that made the difference was the sister of Jose just doing whatever she could, and in that case getting in touch with Univision, which then said in emotional other things that had a really good outcome. So that's my long-winded way of responding.
I'd add, just from the beginning of your question, if they just say they're going to call the cops, this is often a tactic used just to intimidate workers, so that they just won't go away and not be paid. And say, well, they'd rather leave than not be paid to be arrested. And that is the importance of the worker center. I think Professor Deegan was getting at that. You can also say, well, I'm going to call Viva Las Vegas Worker Center, and they're going to represent me, right? And that's sometimes all you need to say, that you have a person on your side to get them, to pressure them to pay. If not, then we can start a claim and we can bring workers to that person's house or that person's place of business to say, this person's not alone and we're fighting for those wages. And like Chris said earlier, that is the most effective way, in my experience, of wages and making sure you can get paid at the end of the day against an unscrupulous employer. The second thing I say, there is a legislative bill there. In California, we have very strong anti-retaliation laws. I think there's some laws here in Nevada as well. And that's something you can push even to get more detail on, to get more strength. And so that's something that threatens you. When you say, try to assert your labor rights, try to assert your civil rights at work, and they threaten you with immigration enforcement or other threats, that person can be held liable criminally in some states for that, or have high sanctions and fines against them. That is itself another deterrent against that. So those are things we can talk about and start to do for listening to those stories.
Can I just add also, there's education, of course, I see a lot of cameras around the room, so there's social media, there's other kinds of, ways in which these communication technologies will facilitate both organizing and also sort of reporting of these violations as well. So that's also something I'm sure the Senate will be involved in.
That's right. Are there any pressing questions before we break for lunch? Great. Thank you so much to our panel, Christina, Kagan, Professor Garcia, for being with us. We're going to have lunch now. Before we go out, we're going to go out to the lobby to get the lunch. When we come back, if you're a monolingual English speaker, we're going to have you pick up interpretation equipment, because we're going to have our worker panel here in Spanish, and we'll have a lot more insight from on the ground. So thank you all for your participation as well.
Viva Las Vegas Worker Center!
Ahora, también. ¿A qué hora? No está perdiendo. Ah, pero va. Bueno que lo menciones. Es que también. No, para no. Ya no necesito.
Nomás volteamos y bueno, Nancy, Miguel y Rodrigo. ¿Traigo café? Sí, aquí estoy, vamos.
Ah, que acabo que café.
Hasta donde está la venta, está en la calle.
Si se gusta sentar las personas para que se vea
Miremos más, vamos a estar así cerquita.
pues para ustedes se benefician de varios. We're going to get started. Anyone who speaks only English, now's the time to get some answers if you don't have one right now. Ahorita vamos a comenzar con el panel de los jornaleros y jornaleras del Centro de Trabajadores de Las Vegas. Arriba, Centro de Trabajadores. El equipo de interpretación ya es tiempo. Y gracias a nuestra intérprete por su trabajo muy bueno hoy. Entonces, por la mañana escuchamos de varios expertos, de profesores y abogados, expertos legales, sobre un estudio que se hizo aquí con los mismos jornaleros que están a punto de comentar de sus casos. Ahora queremos escuchar de ustedes, los que han vivido las experiencias de robo de salario, los abusos laborales que se exponen en el reportaje. Entonces, para los que no me conocen, yo soy Liz, directora de Arriba Centro de Trabajadores, y ahora voy a pedir que nuestros compañeros se presenten, comenzando aquí de este lado.
Sí, buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Edith Soto y pertenezco al Centro de Trabajadores de Las Vegas y me siento muy orgulloso y afortunado de ser parte de este centro. Y ahí quiero compartirles algo de lo que me ha tocado vivir como jornalero y por cosas de la vida, pues le toca a uno que vivir todas estas experiencias, pero yo tengo aproximadamente 13, 14 años de ser jornalero y primero que nada le doy gracias a Dios por darme la oportunidad de saber tantas cosas en la vida y poder desempeñar cualquier trabajo. Y a eso se ha debido de que he tenido la oportunidad de conocer mucha gente y pues hay gente buena y gente que ha sido muy mala para pagar. Y ya perteneciendo al Centro de Trabajadores de Las Vegas, me ocurrió un mal momento con un contratista que es chino. Ya me había ocurrido otras veces, pero por temor a mi estatus y por temor a muchas cosas, yo nunca quise contarle a nadie de lo que me estaba pasando, pero esta vez no aguanté y el asunto fue así que conocí a este señor, le trabajé alrededor como de casi un año y al principio sí todo estaba bien porque me pagaba diario, pero luego cuando ya agarramos confianza me empezó a decir, mira, hoy no te puedo pagar, te voy a pagar el sábado. Y yo viéndolo como no pagaba antes, yo dije, pues le tomé confianza y así empezamos, pero luego ya se tardó un poco más. Mira, ahorita no pude recibir el dinero y te voy a pagar por tal fecha. Y yo le dije, ¿sabes qué? Porque me pagaba por día y luego, ¿sabes qué? Hagamos una cosa, que es mejor el trabajo que pago lo vamos a hacer por un trato. Y me dijo, está bien, dice, pero por lógica no me iba a pagar lo que el trabajo valía, simplemente por la necesidad que yo tenía de trabajar, porque él lo dice así. Y hicimos un contrato, de hecho hicimos 3 contratos, y los primeros 2 me quedó a deber, y yo así lo dejé, pero el último, hicimos un contrato por $1,500, y me dijo, te guardo 200, y yo acepté y empecé a trabajar. Y entonces me levanté una barra muy larga de bloques alrededor de su casa, pero como tenía otros trabajadores en otras casas y yo había hecho mi plan de 6 días para terminar este trabajo y cuando yo llevaba 5 días trabajando, afortunadamente la persona que me fue a ayudar a mí a trabajar fue mi esposa, aquí presente, y cuando se me acabó el material, yo pude terminar el trabajo y ya le dije yo, ¿sabes qué? Necesito el material para terminar, porque a mí me gusta terminar mi trabajo. Y me dijo ya, mañana te lo traigo. Llegamos a esperar el material, no llegó. Y me dijo, mañana te lo traigo porque yo no pude. Y así, total, hicimos 5 días esperando el material. Y llegó un día llegó la dueña y me dijo, yo necesito terminar este trabajo ya. Pues ya le dije, habla con tu contratista, le digo, porque no me trae el material. Y le estuvo hablando. Y hasta el día sábado que lo llegó en la tarde, me llamó y me dijo, ya está el material. Ok, le dije, yo llegué el domingo por la mañana a ver si era cierto, porque muchas mentiras. Sí, efectivamente estaba el material, pero ella me dijo, quiero que lo termines ya porque mañana viene la inspección. Y yo le dije, hoy no te lo puedo terminar, este día tenía la reunión del grupo con el centro de trabajadores y no pude hacerlo. Y le quedó más fácil a la señora ir y contratar a otra persona, le pagó para que terminara el resto del trabajo, que era poquito, como cuestión de la calculaban 5 horas, lo terminaba. Y afortunadamente yo conocí al señor que dejó terminar el trabajo y hablamos, y me habló y dijo, yo la quería terminar el trabajo, me dijo, ¿qué pasó? Y le dije, mira, me dijo, me dio $300 y a mí me tenía que dar $1000. Y claro, para ellos estaba bien, porque íbamos a ahorrar $700. Y ya me llamó y me dice, mira, me dice, como no terminaste el trabajo, la señora buscó otro, luego me dijo, y ya lo terminó antes que tú, para ti el dinero. Y yo le dije, ¿sabes qué? Yo no rompí el contrato, rompiste por no traerme el material. Y no me dijo, aquí perdiste, te quedan ni becas. Pero en ese momento yo pensé que yo mejor ya no muevo nada, que es difícil. Pero no tuve la fortuna de conocer a ti y unirme al centro de trabajadores de Las Vegas y ellos les platiqué la situación, aunque con un poco de pena porque yo la verdad no quería ya hacer nada. Y entonces ellos me ayudaron mucho y organizamos un comité y me acompañaron a la casa donde yo había trabajado porque yo tenía fotografías, tenían videos de lo que había hecho y todo, así que ellos me apoyaron en todo ahí. Y hablamos con la dueña de la casa y el contratista en ese momento no quiso llegar a la reunión que teníamos con ella porque sabía que había tenido la culpa y que por negligencia de él no había terminado el trabajo. Entonces la señora decía, no tengo nada que ver con ya. Pero como ella no hablaba muy bien inglés, llegó a un señor que le tradució y yo tenía a ellos, porque fuimos como 6, 7 personas que me apoyaron en eso. Y ya pues como que el chino por teléfono le habló y dijo que sí, que iba a pagar, que me iba a dar que me diera aquello y tal. Sí me pagó como digamos el 60% del trabajo, porque el otro me lo debía 10, pero si no hubiera sido por el apoyo que recibí del centro de trabajo de Las Vegas, no hubiera recibido nada. Y yo, como ya otras veces me habían hecho lo mismo otras gentes, y yo no hice nada. Afortunadamente no los volví a ver en mi vida, ni los quiero ver. No tienen consideración con el trabajador. Ellos estaban en muchas esquinas y la verdad es que yo me he dado cuenta de lo que uno sufre para poder ganar el dinero y por eso yo sé lo que es ser un familiero, porque le pagan a uno a veces lo que quieren, lo tratan a uno como quieren y uno por temor o no quiere tener problemas con la ley, uno no quiere decir nada, quedarse callado, pero yo lo que les digo es que a mis amigos, compañeros, trabajadores que no tengan el temor que yo tuve, porque si no, vieron que con estos problemas no solo lo afectan a uno como trabajador, sino a toda la familia, porque yo estresado, anda uno que a veces no sabe qué hacer. Y yo le decía al señor a veces, oye, págame, le digo, porque yo necesito dinero, no quiero pagar esto, no quiero pagar aquello. Y me decía, o sea, letre. Yo le decía, no, letre, ¿cuándo es letre? Yo quiero hoy. Me decía, no, quiero estar pagando ahí, tengo que terminar el trabajo. Y yo, pero es que no es mi culpa, le digo, no es mi culpa. Y le digo, es duro estar en las esquinas. Ahora que ya, gracias a Dios, tenemos el centro de Las Vegas, yo me siento más apoyado. Yo, en cualquier momento que me vuelva a suceder lo mismo, que ojalá no, pues ya por lo menos ya tengo un amigo, un apoyo para poder exponerle y ya, pues ya no se siente uno como al principio, porque cuando uno recién llega a este país, pues está expuesto que cualquier persona se aproveche de uno. Y uno, pues, por no conocer, por no saber, pues no, así se la lleva, pero es horrible, es triste. Y muchas veces solo de pensar que hasta en los mismos paisanos le hacen uno esto, duele, pero pues cada quien sabe lo que hace, ¿verdad? Y yo he aprendido mucho a través del centro de trabajadores, porque yo estaba, como quien dice, ciego, porque no sabía que ahora veo, y por eso digo yo, y le digo a todos los jornaleros de todo el país, todo el mundo, que siempre sepan que tienen un apoyo en cualquier grupo, cualquier centro, cualquier que defiende a los trabajadores. Pues muchísimas gracias por escucharme y que Dios los bendiga.
Muchas gracias, Debbie. Es un caso donde se ve el ejemplo de cómo pasan los robos de salarios. El asunto que se platicó, el hecho del reportaje de mañana, siempre mañana, y cuando llega el día del pago. Y también es un ejemplo de alguien que tomó la decisión familiar en este caso. Y como comentó él, parte de esa lucha fue el día. Entonces ahora vamos a seguir escuchando de ella, acerca de lo que se quiere compartir. Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Elvia Ortiz. Doy gracias a todos los representantes, los expertos que están aquí, ayudándonos, apoyándonos. Gracias por su ayuda, por su apoyo. Y de igual manera agradezco a todos los compañeros que están apoyándonos, que estamos unidos. Voy a compartir un poco de este caso que vivimos mi esposo y yo en cuanto al robo del trabajador. No es fácil pasar por esta situación. Estuvimos pasando por una situación muy difícil. No tienen ustedes idea de las ideas que estuvimos viviendo por este tiempo, que no solamente fue un día ni fue una semana, pero hasta el tiempo. Nos tienen que recordar el tiempo que vivimos. Estuvimos esperando un día tras otro, esperando el pago que llegaba. No quisiera ni recordar este día, estos días que estuvimos pasando. Al ver que llegaba los recibos acá. No teníamos por qué pagar.
Sí, es que fue bastante interesante porque pues ella me decía como yo decía, no te preocupes, y como les vuelvo a decir, por fortuna apareció Liz y el centro de trabajar y los muchachos que me apoyaron, que ya no recuerdo su nombre, pero muchísimas gracias por el apoyo que pusieron y gracias a ese apoyo pudimos solucionar muchos problemas que ahora pues ahora ya un poco más cauteloso y tengo más cuidado con saber con quién tengo que trabajar, porque ahora sí en ese momento yo no sabía ni los derechos del trabajador ni cómo podía protegerme, pero gracias al conocimiento que he obtenido a través del centro, ahora sí cómo poder proteger mi salud, mi familia y mi trabajo. Así yo veo que me conviene trabajarlo, aunque tengo necesidad de dinero, pero si no tengo como trabajador, no lo voy a hacer. Porque de mí y de mi trabajo, pues, dependemos mi familia y yo. Por eso les animo a que cualquiera que tenga y esté en la misma situación, que por favor se arrime al centro, ahorita, de lo que sea, y si es acá, pues, los invito a que se unan al centro de trabajo de Las Vegas, que creo que por lo mismo que hicieron conmigo, pues vamos a hacer por todos. Muchas
Gracias a los dos por compartir esta historia. Se ve que duele todavía, pero pusieron en una lucha y salió con un cambio en este caso. Entonces aquí estamos para apoyarnos en el futuro también. Y ahorita vamos a escuchar de otro miembro del centro que también ha experimentado varios casos de robo de salario, con varias experiencias de tratar de resolucionar estos casos. Algunos casos que se logró solucionar y recibir un pago, y pues en otros casos que no tenemos esa todavía. Entonces, con Miguel.
Buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Miguel Flores. Voy a hablarles algo de este caso. El 14 de diciembre o 13 fui a trabajar con una persona de instalar alfombra y quedamos que íbamos a hacer un trato de que me iba a pagar $1000 por hacer todo el trabajo. Entonces yo trabajé desde el día 13 hasta el 16. El día 16 me tenían que pagar la mitad y quedamos que nos íbamos a ver en su tienda. Cuando ya iba a su tienda me dice, mira, no te puedo pagar, no estoy en el hospital con mi niño. Entonces me dice, te pago el lunes. Cuando fui el lunes al trabajo ya estaba otra persona y me dice, ya no puedes seguir porque ya tenemos a otro que tú hacer mal el trabajo, y me sacó de lo que estaba trabajando. El dinero que me iba a dar era muy importante porque estábamos en los días de Navidad y o sea, yo quería comprarle el regalo a mi niño y ahí está que no pude porque no me pagó. Y fuimos a Labor Commission y ahí me tuvieron una junta que está el papel, que ellos cerraron el caso porque la señora me quería dar $200 y son 600 los que me deben. Entonces vine yo, me salí de ahí y lo dejé hablando, porque ella me quería dar $200 y ahí cerró el caso. Me dieron unos papeles para ir a la corte, pero como soy ilegal, ya no fui ahí porque tengo miedo. Como ya me había reportado una vez, por esa razón no puedo ir a la corte. Y gracias al centro de trabajadores que me fijé que existía, acudí ahí con la señorita Briz, que me está ayudando. Es duro, tengo mucho mucho que contar, pero la verdad no puedo. Y muchas gracias. Es lo que les puedo decir.
Gracias, Miguel. Y al rato, a ver si podemos regresar y hablar tantito de los casos que sí se pudo resolucionar, porque también hay otras luchas con algunos buenos resultados, ¿verdad? Ahora escuchamos de don Jaime.
Buenas tardes, soy Jaime Sosa, pertenezco al Centro de Trabajadores de Las Vegas. Tengo una experiencia que omití para unos reporteros que fueron allá a Flamingo y por Apache y me preguntaron, les pido una disculpa por no darles esa experiencia. Mi experiencia es en marzo del año pasado. Yo empecé a trabajar con una persona americana. Una persona, sí era buena persona. Lo que pasa es que con el transcurso del tiempo él empezó a darme un poco más de trabajo, más responsabilidades y me pagaba lo mismo. Entonces ya empezó a decirme, a tratarme mal, o sea, inclusive me empezó a llamar una palabra, un insulto que la verdad, o sea, empezó a dolerme porque me dijo estúpido y de ahí yo empecé a bajar en el trabajo, ya empecé a no hacer cosas que tenía que hacer, o sea, regularmente y él empezó a notar todo eso. Entonces ya empezamos me decía que fuera a las casas a dejar material y yo empecé a decirle sí voy, pero ya no hacía lo que tenía que hacer y inclusive él nunca nos dio equipo para protección. Siempre trabajamos era casi la mayoría era remodelación, o sea, pues trabajo uno sin protección, sin máscaras, sin guantes, o sea, lo que se requiere para trabajar en cuanto a remodelación. Se dice. Entonces ya agarró y una vez me dijo vete a esta casa para acabar ese trabajo que tenemos que acabar. Yo le dije sí y me fui con otro amigo porque los dos estábamos trabajando con él y entonces ya agarró y acabamos ahí y al siguiente día me mandó a otra casa y prácticamente, o sea, yo ya no quise ir y él me habló, me dice, ¿sabes qué? ¿Dónde está este muchacho? Yo le estoy hablando porque tienen que ir a acabar este trabajo y yo le dije, pues la verdad yo no sé nada de él y él me dijo, dice, pues háblame y ya me mandó textos y me estuvo texteando y yo ahora ya no le dije, pues yo no sé, háblale tú, él no me ha hablado, ¿no? Yo ya le hablé, pero él se enojó y a los últimos 2 días que fui a trabajar con él, los últimos días no me los pagó. Entonces fue cuando dije, bueno, pues, o sea, yo tenía su herramienta y él pensó que yo se la iba a robar, pero, o sea, yo, en cuanto él me dijo, ¿sabes qué? Necesito la herramienta, yo fui a la casa a entregársela, le entregué su herramienta, la dejé ahí, él no estaba y se la dejé ahí con las personas que ellos estaban trabajando. Y me dice, te veo en tal parte para darte tu dinero y le dije, bueno, aquí te espero y ahí estoy esperando todo ese día le estuve testeando y llamando y ya no me contestaba. Entonces, pues ya al último dije, bueno, fue casi toda la semana que le estuve diciendo, por favor, dame mi dinero, ya te di tu herramienta, las llaves de las casas donde estuvimos trabajando, también se las devolví. Y nunca hizo caso del dinero que me debía. Entonces, pues ya le dije, ¿sabes qué? Por favor, déjaselo, mándaselo con el muchacho, por favor. Y él me dijo, sí, yo se lo voy a dar. Pero cuando le preguntaba al muchacho, él me dice, no, nunca me dio nada. Y así quedó. Entonces, pues ya, entonces fue cuando me acordé de Liz, porque ella fue a hacer una encuesta allá a la Home Depot y les dije, bueno, pues voy a ir con ella. Y fue cuando yo agarré y Liz me apoyó todo, o sea, me apoyó. Ella fue la que empezó a textearle. Él no respondía al principio, pero ya conforme entró a la página de Facebook, encontró que también su esposa tenía el mismo trabajo de él, o sea, bueno, con diferentes nombres, pero de esa forma se resolvió el caso, y gracias por todo el apoyo que ella me dio, gracias a las personas que siempre también me dijeron que nunca me dejara de esforzarme, de presionarlo para que me diera el dinero que me debía. Esa es una experiencia. Tengo otra experiencia también, pero esa es de hace poco, fuimos a hacer un trabajo de pintura también es una persona, un real estate también, pero él es chino también, él es chino y él también le fuimos a hacer un trabajo de pintura de dos pisos y quedamos en un acuerdo de cuánto nos iba a pagar. El acuerdo era de 1,700, pero resulta que él nos dijo, ¿saben qué? Nomás les voy a dar los 1,700, pero nomás me van o sea, la casa está limpia, nomás denle una pasada y ya, o sea, yo les dije, bueno, está bien, y fuimos 3 personas a trabajar ahí en esa casa y el señor realmente, cuando vio que ya íbamos a acabar, dijo, ¿saben qué? Esta casa no está bien, dice, tienen que darle otra pasada porque no está bien pintada. Y le dijimos, bueno, pues si tú nos estás diciendo que nomás era una pasada, ahora ya nos estás hablando de que hasta las puertas se las tenemos que pintar. Bueno, pues le pintaron, se le pintó todas las puertas, baseboard, todos los baños, o sea, era una casa de 5 recámaras. Entonces al último, pues ya trabajamos 4 días los 3 juntos y al último, pues en el 5.º día ya uno dijo, ¿saben qué? Ya no voy a ir porque la verdad pues ya no nos va a quedar nada de lo que estamos trabajando. Dice, yo ya no voy, dice, él nomás recibió como 240 porque nos había pagado como $800 al principio. Nos dio casi, sí, un poquito más de la mitad, la mitad de lo que del acuerdo de pago. Y al último, pues ya nomás quedamos 2 y le dijimos, pues vamos a acabarle, o sea, lo que él quiere, a ver si al último él considera el trabajo que le estamos haciendo de que nos pague un día, o sea, que nos pague por día, pero nos quedamos todavía otros 4 días ahí trabajándole y al último cuando llegó el último día que se acabó todo, dijo, ¿sabes qué? Ya acabaron, ok, aquí está lo acordado. Le dije, mira, tú bien sabes que trabajamos duro, que nunca inclusive tomamos así descanso para descansar, o sea, ningún break nomás a la hora de la comida. Y estábamos ahí todo el día, o sea, casi fueron 9 horas todos los días. Y dijo, el acuerdo está ahí. Y le digo, bueno, no firmamos nada, pero de todas maneras yo pienso que tú puedes, o sea, no sé si tengas el corazón de darnos por lo menos a 100 el día. Y dice, no, yo no les puedo dar más. Le dije, mira, son 8 días, nosotros trabajamos 8 días, él y yo, y con el otro fueron 4 días. Le digo, nomás date cuenta cuánto dinero es, o sea. Y dijo, no, yo no les puedo pagar más, y nunca nos dio nada. Y así se quedó ese todavía en ese caso no se ha resuelto, pero bueno, ahí quedó todo. Muchas gracias por escucharme.
Pues gracias a los 4 por compartir de los momentos difíciles, porque sí se pasa. Pero también en los 5 meses que hemos estado organizando, se ha visto mucha fuerza y mucho poder. Entonces, el mismo nombre del centro, arriba, vino de otro miembro del centro. También el eslogan de poder, honra y dignidad, otra recomendación de un miembro. Entonces, me gustaría preguntarnos, ¿qué es lo que le hace sentir orgulloso de ser jornalero? ¿Qué es lo que se ha ganado desde la
Bueno, en mi opinión ser jornalero es orgullo para mí, porque de esa manera puedo mantener aquí a mi familia que está aquí presente. No todas ahora sí que las experiencias que he tenido han sido malas, los trabajos no han sido de todo malos, casi la mayoría me ha salido bien. Bueno, son pocas experiencias las mías, pero sí, yo lo único que quiero decirle también a los compañeros, que nunca dejen de luchar por sus derechos, de no sentirse menos ante nadie, y al contrario, o sea, siempre hacia adelante, hacia las cosas que siempre, buenas o malas, siempre son experiencias que nos van a servir para el futuro. Gracias.
Sí, yo me siento afortunado de poder pertenecer al Centro de Trabajadores de la Vejez. La verdad es como una bendición tener siempre una mano amiga, porque es beneficio para mí, para la familia también, y gracias por estar con nosotros. Siempre estoy dispuesto a seguir luchando, no solo por mí, sino por los demás compañeros, para que no se sientan solos, que le echemos ganas y arriba del Centro de Trabajo de los Vejez.
Gracias a ser jornalero yo he podido mantener a mi familia llevo 27 años viviendo aquí en Estados Unidos, pero desde que tumbaron las Torres Gemelas yo he estado yendo a las esquinas, y gracias a ahí he podido mantener a mi familia, incluso hasta la casa tenemos propia. Pero ha sido duro, y gracias a todos por escucharme.
Bueno, gracias. Con los últimos minutos que nos quedan, ¿tienen otro mensaje que quieren compartir con los otros jornaleros y jornaleras que aquí están en este
en lo personal les agradezco mucho el apoyo que nos están dando y créanme que se siente uno bien alto cuando sabe que alguien está con uno, pero a pesar de, yo sé que estas situaciones van a continuar, pero como les digo, no debemos de dejarnos de intimidar y ahora que ya sabemos más de nuestros derechos que podemos tener como jornaleros, apoyémonos unos con otros, porque de otra forma no vamos a lograr nada. En cambio, si estamos juntos siempre vamos a poder salir adelante.
Quiero platicar un poco con nuestra mala experiencia que tuvimos en cuanto a las personas que estaban a sus trabajadores que no tienen ni la menor idea de lo que están haciendo, porque no solamente están robándole el salario a sus trabajadores, sino le están robando también a la familia completa su libertad de seguir siendo feliz, porque le roban pues toda su libertad de tener su hogar feliz como anteriormente, que estábamos, que no nos hacía falta que comer, que no nos hacía falta un techo. Para estos momentos que estuvimos pasando nosotros, que no teníamos que comer, no me da vergüenza decirlo, porque así fue. Aquí mi vecino presente era la que a veces le daba de comer a mí, porque no teníamos que comer. Cuando yo abría el recibo de la luz, que ya debíamos $700 porque nos habían pagado, nos cortaron el servicio de la luz. Estuvimos a pleno verano sin aire acondicionado. Y nos llegaba una carta de desalojo por 5 días. Si no pagábamos en 5 días nos iban a desalojar. Pero gracias a Dios mi esposo consiguió un poco de dinero, pagó lo que se debía del recibo de la luz, $700. Tuve que llamar a la compañía y decir que nos instalaran el servicio, porque mi hijo padece de asma y necesitaba usar su inhalador cada 2 horas y no teníamos electricidad para poderlo usar. Para entonces ya no eran $700, ya eran $800 que se debían y no los teníamos. Tuvimos que esperar a que él consiguiera otro poco para poderlo pagar. En eso nos llegó el aviso de 5 días de desalojo y también teníamos atrasado 2 meses de renta. Si no lo pagábamos de 5 días, nos iban a desalojar. Y esperando a que este hombre que no se tocaba el corazón para poderle pagar los días que él había trabajado, tuvimos que esperar hasta que encontramos que Dios nos puso en nuestro camino en el centro de trabajadores. Y gracias a Dios y a Cris que nos ayudó a pelear este caso, ella tomó cartas en el asunto y así fue como se pudo resolver este problema. Gracias a Dios y a ella que luchó y nos ayudó a salir adelante. Ella puso mucho de su parte y le agradezco por su duro esfuerzo que hace y su trabajo para poder ayudar a todos los trabajadores. Y les invito a que ustedes también no se queden callados, porque a veces por causa de estar callados que no quiere uno tomar cartas en el asunto, tiene un miedo tal vez a que no tiene uno el apoyo, no tiene esas ayudas, uno no sabe uno dónde encontrar las ayudas para que esta persona no se quede con su dinero de su trabajo, porque no estamos aquí para robar a nadie, hacer nuestro trabajo, pero que nos paguen nuestro trabajo. Esto es lo que quiero compartir con ustedes.
Y bueno, hay que reconocer fuerza, que ha puesto su lucha. Y a los compañeros aquí que estaban presentes en estos casos de Jaime, de él y Elia, y fue por la participación en lo demás, de mi punto de vista, que se pudo ganar estos casos. Y pues ahorita tenemos unos 10 minutos. Si alguien aquí quiere hacerme una pregunta, ¿algunos están dispuestos a contestar? Entonces, a ver, si alguien me quiere preguntar algo, también lo podemos traducir de inglés a español.
I guess I could start by asking, like, is anybody preparing for a lawsuit?
Pues la pregunta es si estamos preparando una demanda. In a specific case?
Any case that you have, any of your cases, are you considering taking legal action against the, people responsible for the theft here in the valley?
En cualquier caso, están pensando en tomar una acción legal en contra de los empleadores abusivos. Entonces, a ver si uno, capaz que don Jaime podría explicar tantito del proceso que se está usando dentro del Comité de Robo de Salario acerca de cómo llevar los casos.
Primero, o sea, el primer punto del robo de salarios, lo que se hace es mandarle una carta o hablarle por teléfono para ver si contesta el patrón. Y el segundo paso es, si en caso de que no contesta esa persona, o sea, se llega a una comitiva, o sea, personas que se juntan para ir a la casa de las personas para presionarlos de esta manera.
También en contestación a esta pregunta, por la mañana en el primer panel se hablaba de la dificultad de resolver los casos por una forma legal, que la manera más eficaz de resolver los casos ha sido por la presión y la organización de la comunidad, como en el caso que vimos y compartieron en
Quiero decir algo. Solo quiero agregar algo y decir que cuando decimos jornaleros son mujeres y somos hombres, y yo en verdad agradezco a Dios y que bendiga a todas las mujeres del mundo y las esposas y no esposas, porque son una gran fuerza para nosotros, porque ¿quién entiende mejor a un esposo como una esposa? Y muchas gracias a las mujeres por entendernos y por apoyarnos.
Sí, ¿hay otra pregunta? ¿O un comentario para los compañeros?
Yo quisiera comentar soy miembro de la mesa directiva de la Red Nacional de Jornaleros y en nombre de todos nuestros compañeros y a nivel mío personal también quiero comentarles el gran orgullo que representa para nosotros como miembros de la red tener un nuevo centro y agradecerles su lucha a Tiblis, agradecerles la lucha y que todo el mundo sepa que aquí en Las Vegas ya no estamos solos y los empleadores pueden hacer de las suyas, porque tenemos a Bliss y arriba el Networker Center que se va a volver un centro comunitario en donde todo lo bueno se va a hacer posible, donde todos los sueños de la gente se convierten en realidad, porque va a haber amor y va a haber lucha. La Red Nacional de Jornaleros es una organización que siempre va a estar velando por los intereses de los jornaleros y que todos estamos muy, muy orgullosos y agradecidos con su lucha por ser un miembro más.
niños y a todos. Ahorita a la 1:30 vamos a seguir con la siguiente presentación. Entonces tomamos un pequeño descanso para que los siguientes presentadores se preparen. Y aquí ahorita vamos a pasar la palabra con Pablo Alvarado, también de la Red Nacional de Jornaleros, a la 1:30.
Realmente no sé, se me hace que casi todos los hombres, pero nomás uno fue el que no avanzaba. Siempre hay uno que no avanza. Que nomás uno no sale de la vez y... De hecho, no fotos a la técnica.
How are you doing?
Aunque sea, what else? What are the Me tengo que preparar. Nomás díganme, nomás como la que se metió ahí, como dos o tres cabras, que se metió ahí, lo que quería ir a hacer. Y luego, digo, sácala, la cara de la como la se va. Ahí estaba, es que no me estaba echando plática y nomás.
Bueno, Marín. Pero luego, con la familia, ahí está la abuelita. Y nomás ahí y de repente
I know.
Right, I think I would remember.
pero ahí la tienes que ganar por sorpresa. Es lo mejor. ¿Sí la miró? ¿La miró? ¿Mandaban eso? Todos dicen que sí, ¿verdad? Todos que sí,
Hi everybody, we're going to get started with this next and final part of the program for the day. If this next portion is going to be spoken in English, correct? Spanglish. So the folks that don't have interpreting devices, I realized at times it was a little bit spotty into English. We had to change the batteries, but that's been resolved. But a portion right now will be in English. Entonces una porción va a ser en inglés ahorita. Entonces si tienen sus equipos, pónganselos aquí en el cuellito y ya cuando empiecen a hablar en inglés se los ponen. Y si no pueden escuchar, alcen la mano y para que yo o para que Cal, que está atrás, nos deje saber. ¿Sí? Y nada más nos hacen así. Okay, so with that, we'll go on to the next portion of the program. And for the folks that are tweeting or on Facebook, we're doing hashtag Arriba Las Vegas. Okay? Para los que están tuiteando o en Facebook, si ponen algo en Facebook, toman una foto y lo quieren poner en Facebook, estamos poniendo como hashtag Arriba Las Vegas. Entonces, ahorita hay un montón de cosas que están ya, fotos bien bonitas del evento, que si pones hashtag Arriba Las Vegas. Ajá, por ejemplo. Thank you.
Arriba Las Vegas. Bueno, how should I do it, Carl? In English or in Spanish? Everybody has... Okay. Bueno, lo voy a hacer back and forth. Okay.
Spanglish.
Bueno, Spanglish. Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes.
Mi nombre es Pablo Alvarado y yo trabajo como director de la Red Nacional de Jornaleros y Jornaleras. Y pues en nombre de nuestra organización, junto con María, venga para acá, María.
Aquí está solito.
Nosotros somos parte de la dirección de la Red Nacional de Jornaleros. En nombre de nuestra red, que hay en los Estados Unidos hay 70 centros de jornaleros como el de la Cámara. Y nos ha sido un sacrificio enorme crear esos centros, ¿verdad? Pero afortunadamente esos son los vehículos que tenemos para defender a nuestra comunidad. Y quiero decirle que María ha venido desde Comunidad a ser directora de esta organización allá en uno de los centros más fuertes que tiene nuestra organización. Ahí María todos los días está abriendo un centro y manda 1000 trabajadores al mes a trabajar. Bueno, miren, yo sé de que estamos en una situación muy precaria en este país, ¿verdad? Una situación donde los derechos de las personas todos los días son minados. No nada más los derechos de las personas indocumentadas, sino también los derechos de la comunidad afroamericana, de la comunidad musulmana, de la comunidad LGBTQ, ¿verdad? De las mujeres. Entonces, quiero decir que afortunadamente la comunidad migrante, la comunidad jornalera, no son los únicos que están bajo ataque. Y a mis amigos, a mis compañeros, pues, inmigrantes, ¿verdad? Pues, siempre que voy a estos lugares y platico con los trabajadores, siempre les traigo buenas noticias. La buena noticia es que Trump ha dicho que él nada más va a perseguir y deportar a los criminales. Las malas noticias es que todos somos criminales. Y ustedes han podido ver últimamente, ¿verdad?, cómo activistas están siendo ya el target, el objetivo de la represión, de la persecución de esta administración, ¿verdad? Entonces, se habla del miedo, ¿verdad? Y el miedo es algo real. Cuando uno va a trabajar con un patrón, el patrón está en una posición de poder, ¿verdad? Es el que tiene los medios de producción, es el que tiene las herramientas, tiene todo el poder, y tiene el dinero, ¿verdad? Y cuando uno tiene esa relación, a veces que es una relación de miedo. Uno no se tiene temor de acercarse y de platicar con el patrón, ¿verdad? De igual a igual, porque lo vemos como una persona con autoridad, ¿verdad? Ese tipo de patrones se han envalentonado ahora que tienen a un patrón sin escrúpulos en la Casa Blanca y han perdido el miedo. Han perdido el miedo de maltratar, han perdido la vergüenza de robar el salario a las personas. Son personas sin escrúpulos. Han perdido ese miedo de tener escrúpulos, de tener conciencia, ya no les importa. Entonces existe ese segmento de empleadores que son igual que el presidente que está ahorita en la Casa Blanca. Y son personas que se van a aprovechar de la vulnerabilidad de todo trabajador, no importa de dónde venga, de quién sea, se van a aprovechar para robarle su salario, y no nada más para robarle su salario, porque ese es el síntoma. Como comienza es que primero le tratan de robar la dignidad al trabajador, primero le tratan de quitar y de verlo como una persona subhumana, porque esa es la única manera como pueden justificar no pagarle, robarle el salario al trabajador, viéndolo al trabajador como menos, ¿o no? Esa es la lógica de ellos, ¿verdad? Y cómo hacen que la gente vea menos a la gente es promoviendo el miedo. Y el miedo, ¿verdad?, es muy peligroso, porque ¿qué pasa cuando usted tiene miedo y alguien lo ataca? ¿Usted se puede defender bien?
No.
¿Por qué?
Porque tengo miedo.
Porque tiene miedo, sí. Y se agacha uno y se va a meter, se va a esconder, ¿o no? Entonces uno puede luchar y defenderse si tiene miedo.
No.
Entonces dice lo primero, que el centro que ustedes tienen, arriba tiene que ser remover ese miedo. ¿Se puede o no se puede?
Sí, puede.
Tampoco uno puede defenderse cuando está enojado, cuando tiene rencor, odio en el corazón, ¿verdad? Esos son sentimientos que le entrampan la mente a uno y no puede ejercer una defensa racional, ¿verdad? Y muchas veces cuando está enojado y alguien viene, lo que uno hace es tirar, ¿verdad? Y eso muchas veces no ayuda a nada. Entonces, uno no se puede defender si tiene miedo, si está enojado o si tiene rencor, odio en el corazón. Entonces, arriba, esa es una de las tareas de arriba, que la gente más humilde no tenga miedo. Obviamente, ¿verdad?, hay fuerzas grandes, como este hombre que tenemos en la Casa Blanca, un hombre muy poderoso, y sus seguidores, cuya finalidad es la promoción del miedo. Ellos quieren de que ustedes, la comunidad, no nada más la comunidad indocumentada, la comunidad trabajadora, pero sobre todo la comunidad inmigrante, le tenga miedo al gobierno, que le tenga miedo a la policía, que le tenga miedo a las instituciones que supuestamente deben de administrar la justicia, de modo de que si un patrón le roba su salario, usted tenga miedo de ir a la comisión laboral, porque la migra puede estar allí, ¿verdad? O ir a la corte, ¿verdad? Entonces, o reportar un crimen a una institución cuando usted es testigo o víctima, ¿verdad? Entonces, es lo que quiere esta administración, promover ese miedo, que los inmigrantes le tengamos miedo al gobierno federal. ¿Pero para qué? Bien sencillo. Primero, para que cedamos nuestros derechos y digamos, no, pues ya no voy a pelear por nuestros derechos. Es lo que quieren. Infundir ese miedo para que nosotros no luchemos ni peleemos por nuestros derechos. Y que nos autodeportemos. Esa es la lógica. Esta administración también quiere que los estadounidenses, los ciudadanos, le tengan miedo a los inmigrantes, ¿verdad? Por eso es que cuando ustedes ven en las noticias, por ejemplo, en Virginia, las imágenes que pusieron durante la campaña electoral para gobernador eran las imágenes de pandilleros con los grandes tatuajes en la frente que decía MS, ¿verdad? Y la idea es proyectar ese miedo. Incluso el general Kelly acaba de dar un instructivo
al interior del Departamento de Seguridad Nacional, diciendo de que hay que caracterizar a los inmigrantes como criminales, ¿verdad? Y eso otra vez, ¿con qué fin? Para que los estadounidenses nos tengan miedo a nosotros, que nosotros representamos una amenaza para ellos, ¿verdad? Esta administración también quiere que los oficiales electos progresistas que quieren pasar leyes para proteger a los inmigrantes le tengan miedo al gobierno federal, porque le van a quitar los fondos, etcétera, ¿verdad? Entonces, en sí es una agenda de promoción del miedo, ¿verdad? Y la verdad es que no nada más ellos promueven el miedo, sino que todos los días nos enfrentamos a situaciones que generan miedo. Un trabajador, por ejemplo, ¿verdad? Un trabajador jornalero, una trabajadora jornalera, que cada día se levanta temprano en la mañana y no sabe si la van a contratar y si le van a pagar, no sabe si se va a lastimar en el lugar de trabajo y va a haber atención médica, ¿verdad? No sabe si van a llegar grupos supremacistas blancos a levantarlos de la esquina y llevarlos a lugares abandonados y a golpearlos, ¿verdad? No sabe si la policía van a llegar y los van a arrestar. Es decir, el trabajador se enfrenta a una cantidad de incertidumbres todos los días que generan miedo. Pero ¿qué es lo que hace el trabajador de todas maneras? ¿Acaso ustedes no vencen ese miedo todas las mañanas? Entonces, ¿no podemos vencer este miedo que Trump quiere imponer en nosotros? ¿No se puede? ¿Se puede o no se puede? Claro que se puede remover ese miedo. Se puede. ¿Solitos?
No.
¿Cómo? Unidos. A través de nuestras instituciones, a través de nuestras organizaciones. Y eso es lo que ustedes tienen la oportunidad de construir aquí en Las Vegas. Con el nuevo centro de trabajadores. Hubo un ejercicio que hicieron hace poco unos trabajadores. Les preguntaban a ellos qué significa arriba para ustedes, qué significa el centro de trabajadores para ustedes. Y yo quiero compartir lo que algunos contestaron. Número 1, la trinchera desde donde defendemos nuestros derechos. Qué bonito, ¿verdad? Antes no teníamos esa trinchera. Las personas humildes podemos construir nuestras propias trincheras. Número 2, la chispa que hace brillar nuestra cultura. Porque cuando uno tiene cultura, cuando uno sabe de dónde viene y hacia dónde va, no hay nadie que lo pueda humillar, ¿verdad? Cuando uno tiene orgullo propio, someterse ante la humillación es imposible cuando uno sabe quién es, qué es lo que tiene en el corazón. Por eso la cultura es muy importante y por eso este centro va a promover una cultura de liberación. Está muy bonito. Dijeron, es el megáfono que amplifica nuestras voces. Qué bonito, ¿verdad? El lugar donde la solidaridad cobra vida. Miren qué bonito. El vehículo para construir el poder del pueblo. La casa desde donde defendemos a todo mundo desde abajo. Un santuario para toda la gente trabajadora en circunstancias de vulnerabilidad. El espacio donde todas las opiniones cuentan, aunque seamos personas humildes. El lugar donde nunca estamos solos. El hogar donde resolvemos nuestras diferencias. Muchos dijeron, y esto lo he escuchado por todo el país, de los trabajadores, mi centro es mi segunda casa, mi segundo hogar, es el espacio para los inmigrantes y los trabajadores. Esas son las opiniones que la gente tiene de su centro. Entonces ustedes que no son trabajadores, que no son miembros del centro, ¿verdad?, que están acá, les pedimos que lo apoyemos, que ayudemos a ese centro a fortalecerlo y que sea un lugar donde las personas humildes puedan tener mucho poder, ¿verdad?, para hacer cambios fuertes en esta sociedad. Ahorita miren lo que está pasando, es muy triste porque pues todas estas peleas que están ocurriendo en Washington del presupuesto, ¿verdad?, de Obamacare, de todo lo que se está peleando pues en Washington DC, todos los temas sociales que se discuten como el aborto, el gay marriage, todas estas cosas, ¿verdad? Que son muy importantes para que la humanidad avance, ¿verdad? Y son discusiones que todo el mundo tiene que tener, ¿verdad? Pero hay una que nos olvidamos con mucha frecuencia, y esa es de que la contradicción entre los que tienen y los que no tienen nunca se ha terminado. Ahí está. Y nosotros debemos de construir instituciones que ayuden a resolver ese hueco que hay entre los que tienen y los que no tienen. El centro arriba, el centro de trabajadores, desde mi perspectiva, es una expresión de la lucha de clases en la vecindad, porque esa lucha no se ha terminado. La lucha para que los trabajadores se les respete y tengan mejores condiciones de trabajo y mejores salarios no se ha terminado. Ahorita les acaban de dar incluso un tax break a los ricos, que los están haciéndose más, pero más ricos todavía. Ya pasó eso, ya ni hablamos de eso, ¿verdad? Pero cuando ustedes van a las vecindades y ven la pobreza, viene de allí. Cuando ven la gente que no tiene casas, viene de allí, de esas desigualdades económicas. Entonces nosotros nunca podemos olvidar de que hay una lucha de clases, de que nuestras instituciones deben de asegurarse de que la riqueza por lo menos se distribuya de una manera más o menos mejor de cómo está distribuida, o que por lo menos que a cada trabajador y trabajadora que se gana el pan de cada día con el sudor de su frente, que le paguen bien. Y para eso va a estar el centro de trabajadores de Las Vegas, arriba. ¿De acuerdo? Y miren, hay muchas leyes, y yo sé que ya hablamos de esto mucho, ¿verdad? Pero si ustedes ven el código laboral, yo no he visto el código laboral de acá de Las Vegas, está grueso, más o menos, ¿estará así? ¿De grueso? Más pequeño. Pero hay bastantes leyes en ese código laboral, ¿verdad? ¿Cómo cuántas leyes? 100, 500 leyes, más o menos, ¿verdad? ¿Las enforzan? ¿Las implementan? No. Ok. Ahora les voy a hacer esta pregunta. Cuando una persona joven, un hombre de color, un muchacho de color, se mete a una tienda y se roba un dulce, ¿cuántos policías hay para perseguir a esa persona? ¿Cuántos policías hay para perseguir al patrón que le roba el salario al trabajador? Estas son las desigualdades, compañeros y compañeras. Por eso nosotros no podemos recurrir al sistema legal, porque está hecho para beneficiar al patrón. Hay veces que tenemos un papel que dice, sí, ustedes ganaron, pero ¿de qué fregado sirve ese papel si no podemos usarlo para ir a recuperar los salarios? Entonces yo lo que les quiero decir es que sí tenemos que empujar para que hagan cambios en las leyes, para que la Comisión Laboral sea más responsable, ¿verdad? Pero en última instancia, compañeros y compañeras, solo el pueblo, ¿qué? Salva al pueblo, ¿o no? Entonces, en última instancia, nos tenemos a nosotros. Y afortunadamente hay un montón de gente con mucha conciencia, aliados, amigos, hermanos, ¿verdad? De muchos caminos de la vida, que creen en lo que nosotros estamos haciendo, de que debe de haber un poco de justicia en nuestra comunidad, ¿verdad? Entonces, yo pienso de que a esa gente tenemos que traerla, porque para hacer los cambios no lo podemos hacer solo. No vivimos en una isla. No debemos de asumir de que todos los patrones son malos, ¿verdad? Que todas las personas blancas son racistas. No debemos de hacer ese tipo de asunciones, nunca, ¿verdad? Porque no es así, ¿verdad? Para hacer cambios para todo el mundo, debemos de ser inclusivos. Y algo muy importante que nuestra organización siempre ha creído. Nosotros escogimos, ¿verdad?, la comunidad jornalera como nuestra comunidad para hacer nuestro servicio, precisamente porque la comunidad jornalera ha sido estigmatizada como una comunidad indeseable, que molesta, lo que dicen, pues, que molestan a las personas que se pasan por la calle, que hacen tantas cosas, ¿verdad?
Pero cuando usted va a las esquinas, lo que ve son padres de familia que están esperando un trabajo. Y de vez en cuando llega una persona que tiene un problema con alcohol, como en cualquier otra comunidad, ¿o no? ¿Verdad? Como cualquier otro grupo, ¿verdad? Entonces, nosotros decidimos que íbamos a defender a esa comunidad vulnerable, por la simple y sencilla razón que cuando uno protege al que está más fregado, cuando uno mejora los estándares del que está más fregado, automáticamente levanta los estándares de todos los demás, ¿no? Bueno, y eso lo podemos hacer aquí en Las Vegas, a través de arriba, a través del vehículo que ustedes están construyendo, ¿verdad? Las organizaciones que construimos, compañeros y compañeras, son imperfectas, ¿verdad? Como somos los seres humanos, ¿verdad? Y es importante reconocer la imperfección de las organizaciones, porque arriba va a ser imperfecto y va a tener muchos errores, pero lo importante es que ustedes platiquen, ¿verdad? Dialoguen, porque ese es su espacio, ¿verdad? Entonces, quisiéramos regresar en un año a este mismo lugar y tener ese cuarto lleno, y que el centro tenga 1000 miembros, y que tenga más organizadores, y que tenga más organizadoras, y que tiemble Trump cuando escuche de arriba. ¿Sabe qué? Porque si hay alguien que tiene miedo, si hay alguien que tiene miedo, no somos nosotros, es el Trump y sus secuaces. Y saben, cuando un bully, ¿verdad?, tiene miedo, quiere compartir ese miedo con todos los demás para que lo sigan. Eso es lo que los bullies hacen, ¿verdad? Pero si ustedes nada más recuerdan de los que somos inmigrantes, lo que hemos pasado para llegar acá, ustedes han cruzado desiertos. Yo me subí a la bestia para llegar acá, ¿verdad? Crucé ríos, muchos han cruzado océanos. En nuestros países hemos enfrentado carteles de la droga, pandillas, pobreza extrema, persecución política, persecución policial, represión. ¿Qué no hemos enfrentado? ¿Dictadores o no?
Sí, de todo.
Entonces, ¿por qué tenemos miedo? ¿Verdad? Si ya hemos enfrentado todas esas cosas. Simplemente lo que tenemos que hacer es recordar, ¿verdad?, de que hemos pasado situaciones bien difíciles y que las hemos superado. Y sabe que el Trump le tiene miedo a nuestra capacidad de creatividad, a nuestra capacidad de empujar hacia adelante. Nosotros estamos creando familias, todos los días salimos allá afuera con una ética de trabajo que muchos envidian. ¿Acaso ustedes creen que los que marcharon allá en Charlottesville con los Tiki Torches, los White Nationalists, son los que van a ir a reconstruir allá en Houston y en Florida y en el norte de California? ¿Van a ser ellos los que van a reconstruir?
No.
Va a ser nuestro pueblo, van a ser los trabajadores inmigrantes. Si usted va a Houston, son equipos de construcción latinos, ¿verdad?, de 5 o 10 personas, muchos de ellos sin papeles. Esos son los que están reconstruyendo Houston y Florida y el norte de California. No son los que le tienen miedo a perder el estatus de mayoría blanca, porque esto es muy importante, que yo quiero compartir esto con ustedes. Es un puñado nada más, es un segmento de personas que creen de que nosotros los inmigrantes representamos una amenaza para su poder y que en determinado momento van a pasar a ser minoría, ¿verdad? Es el mismo miedo que tenían los dueños de los esclavistas cuando los esclavos querían ser libres. Es el mismo miedo que tenían los hombres cuando las mujeres estaban peleando por el derecho a votar. Es el mismo miedo que tienen estas personas. Y los únicos que nos podemos liberar de ese miedo, ¿quién es? Nosotros. Y diciéndoles que no les tenemos miedo, pero que tampoco los odiamos, ¿verdad? Entonces ese es el mensaje que ustedes tienen que llevar a todos lados, a todas las esquinas, con el centro tan bonito que ustedes están creando aquí en Las Vegas. Podemos tener ese compromiso. Yo les aseguro de que vamos a acompañar los esfuerzos que ustedes hagan. Y yo quiero presentar a un compañero, a un amigo, ¿verdad?, que yo sé que va a acompañar arriba por los años que vienen, el presidente de Maldev, mi compañero, amigo Tom Saenz. nosotros en 1992 iniciamos una campaña para desafiar las leyes que habían hecho que el pararse en la banqueta fuese un crimen. O sea, si usted para en una banqueta lo iban a multar. ¿Se acuerdan de eso, verdad? Que había muchas leyes por todo el país. Pues comenzamos la batalla, la campaña de litigación en contra de esas leyes en 1992. Y obviamente nosotros no somos millennials, entonces no necesariamente creemos en instant gratification, como dicen, ¿verdad? Comenzamos en 1992 y nos tomó 20 años porque culminó la campaña en 2012 y ganamos, y finalmente los jornaleros se pueden parar en las calles y decir: aquí estoy, esta es mi mano de obra, vengan y contrátenme, que soy un hombre trabajador, soy una mujer trabajadora fuerte. Y ha sido por la lucha que todos hemos hecho y por el esfuerzo que nos ayudó a hacer nuestro abogado Tom Symes durante todos esos 20 años. Así que, compañeros y compañeras, no estamos solos. En la construcción de su centro va a haber mucha gente que los va a acompañar. Aquí hay compañeros de Pasadena, ¿verdad?, que lo vinieron a ver, que vinieron en solidaridad con ustedes para mostrarles cómo operan esos centros, ¿verdad? Estos son vehículos increíbles para la justicia, para promover la igualdad, la integración de nuestras comunidades, etc. Entonces, sin más, yo le quiero dar la bienvenida a mi compañero y amigo, Tom Symes.
Buenas tardes. I don't know if Pablo and I can still be friends when he makes me follow him. But hopefully I can touch on some of the same themes. He talked about the 20-year campaign to overturn literally dozens and dozens of local laws around California, around the western United States, around the entire country, that sought to prohibit day laborers from engaging in free speech, a constitutionally protected First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution right to engage in free speech on street corners and sidewalks. And it was a long campaign. And it's important to remember that it's a campaign that began in response to what the other side would call organizing. Now, we all know that organizing for the other side, the immigration restrictionists, is different. They can get, what, a dozen people to a demonstration. You can get 100 times that. But an organization called FAIR, the Federation for American Immigration Reform, over many, many years promoted these laws. They would tell folks who were interested in restricting the rights of immigrants, what you can do in your local community is pass a law to stop day laborers from exercising their free speech rights. They promoted it on their website. That's why there ended up being so many ordinances around California, around the western United States, and the country. It's important also to remember that that 20-year campaign lasted as long as it did because we started, unfortunately, with a loss. It all began with a state court case in California where a judge in the trial court and then 3 justices in an appellate court decided that it was okay, permissible under the Constitution, for ordinances that barred the free speech rights of day laborers to exist. And that's why it took multiple cases to overcome that one loss. Because that one loss led to city after city deciding that they could copy word for word the law that the ordinance upheld in that case used, copy it word for word and enact it into their local ordinances. So it took us years and years to get to a higher court, a federal appellate court. In the end, with 11 justices, the 11 judges of the federal court, deciding that in fact day laborers do have free speech rights and that these ordinances violate them. But it went through many cases. We started against Los Angeles County. And then we went against Rancho Cucamonga and Upland, the Inland Empire in California. And then against Glendale, a suburb of Los Angeles. And up north in Los Altos.
We win.
And we won. And finally against the city of Redondo Beach city in Los Angeles County. That's the case that went to the 11 judges of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, the federal court, just below the U.S. Supreme Court that decides what the law will be in all of the western United States, including in Nevada. And those 11 judges decided to overturn a decision by 3 of their own judges that had concluded that these ordinances were okay. But in the end, 9 of those 11 judges, 9-2, decided that in fact these ordinances violate free speech rights. Critically important decision. I note that one of those 9 was actually the judge that wrote the decision that was being overturned. So she changed her mind and understood that these laws violate free speech rights. So it was a long struggle. The history then of Andilon, of day laborers, is of continuing to fight in the face of adversity and prevailing in the end. And at MALDEF, we're very proud of this partnership with Andilon over those 20 years, where, as Chris Newman mentioned this morning, it was mutually supporting. The lawsuits helped the day laborers in organizing and working to protect their rights, but at the same time the organizing, the demonstrating, the making the public aware through the media and otherwise of the importance of these issues, in turn has an influence in the thinking of judges and courts. If they're not aware of the issues, and many of them, these judges, you know where they come from, they're not necessarily aware of these issues. They got to read about them. They got to see them on social media in this day and age, or the people who work for them have to see them in social media. When we raise the profile of the issues, it makes a difference in court, even in the highest court, the U.S. Supreme Court, with the 9 justices in Washington. So this was a mutually reinforcing effort of litigation, the lawsuits, and organizing. It started in adversity and ended in victory. We need more of that today, you've already heard it, but I want to give you another example. Perhaps the most surprising thing through that 20 years was when I was asked, after we filed the lawsuit in Rancho Cucamonga and Upland, by a television reporter who seemed to be an educated man. He asked me the question, but do undocumented immigrants have free speech rights? I was shocked. I thought that it was pretty universally understood that under our Constitution, rights are granted to persons, with very few exceptions. Rights are granted to persons, not citizens. The only exceptions are rights like the right to vote, and a very, very small number of others that under the Constitution are allocated to citizens. All of the rights, including free speech rights, are allocated to persons, human beings. Now, I want to know that the Latino community has a long history of confronting that kind of ignorance. I want to tell you a story about another important case. 35 years ago. In fact, you may recall, this past June 15th, Donald Trump decided to rescind DAPA. Not DACA, but DAPA. Deferred Action for Parents of Americans, the initiative that was announced in November 2014 by President Obama, that the state of Texas, it's always the state of Texas, the state of Texas sought to prevent from being implemented and succeeded in getting a single judge to block that initiative that would have granted protections to up to 4 million folks who have been providing the backbone of our economy, the backbone of our community. One judge blocked it, and then a very conservative Court of Appeals, Federal Court of Appeals in Texas, left that block in place. And you may recall it went to the U.S. Supreme Court. And because We only had 8 justices instead of 9. They split 4-4 in June of 2016. And therefore that left that judge's order blocking DAPA from ever taking effect in place. So this DAPA initiative that was never implemented, that Donald Trump said in his campaign he disagreed with, he left it in place. He could have, with one stroke of his pen, removed DAPA from the books. He left it in place until June 15th. And under threat by the state of Texas, again, he withdrew DAPA. Had no practical effect because it had never been implemented. But his political advisors are so ignorant of our struggle and our history in the Latino community that they issued that withdrawal on June 15th, 2017, which was the 35th anniversary, an important anniversary, the 35th anniversary of an important Supreme Court decision called Plyler versus Doe. I want to tell you about Plyler versus Doe. Plyler versus Doe was a decision that came out of Texas. As I said, it's always Texas. Because Texas in the mid-1970s decided to tell school districts throughout that large state that they could prevent undocumented immigrant children from enrolling in public school, either by blocking them entirely or by charging them tuition, knowing that they could not afford the tuition and would therefore not be able to go to school. Texas did this without regard to what it meant for the education of its people, without regard for what it meant to the safety and security of those children, without regard for what it meant to the long-term health of the economy of that state and our nation. And it was challenged. It took 5 years. It was challenged by MALDEF, the organization I now have the great privilege of leading. But it took 5 years to get to the Supreme Court. And ultimately, the decision that we celebrated the 35th anniversary of on that day in June last year. The Supreme Court decided that Texas had violated the Constitution, that there is a constitutional right for every child to attend public school free of charge, from kindergarten through 12th grade, all the way through high school, regardless of the immigration status of that child. And that's what Plyler is known for. But lesser known, but very important in the law, is that the state of Texas contended to the Supreme Court that the constitutional right of equal protection that was being raised against that Texas law could not be invoked by undocumented immigrants. Texas made this argument even though that is a right that clearly is assigned to all persons. But Texas, in essence, argued that under the law, undocumented immigrants were not persons. And what the court decided in Plyler versus Doe, and what we celebrated that last June for the 35th time, is that persons means what it sounds like. All human beings. And someone's immigration status does not render them a non-person for purposes of the Constitution. That's important. But it also tells us we've faced this battle before. We've won it before, with long-term positive repercussions. Because it's a clear line from Plyler versus Doe and the right of children to go to school through high school. Then in the 1990s, there were movements around this country to ensure that undocumented children could also go to college at affordable rates. And those students who went on to college, despite their status, did well in college, are now the dreamers that we all support, leading a battle against the White House to ensure that their rights are protected, that what they achieved under DACA, the right to work and to be free from the threat of being removed, would continue. Not only that, those dreamers who benefited from the Plyler versus Doe decision have created the most important
youth movement this country has seen in half a century. We haven't seen the level of youth activism that our dreamers are demonstrating and influence on the nation, on the White House, since the 1960s. Half a century. And it's a straight line from that Plyler versus Doe victory in making sure that person means person to what we see today. Now, why is that important? That question from that reporter, that ignorant reporter, who didn't understand that free speech is a universal human right under our Constitution, belonging to every person. That question, unfortunately, is coming back. Because as you know, and as Pablo has so eloquently recounted for us, we have a president who is seeking to create a clear, strict distinction between citizens and immigrants. Now, for whatever reason, it's amusing sometimes it's aggravating, well, a lot of times it's aggravating, but it's also helpful. For whatever reason, I get emails from Donald Trump's campaign. Really, mostly aggravating, sometimes amusing, but what we saw last week in these emails and in these tweets was an attempt, as the Congress debated a continuing resolution to keep the government going, the budget to keep the government going. His rhetoric, his language was about how the Democrats were putting the rights of citizens below the rights of immigrants. Trying to draw a distinction that has no meaning. Has no meaning in our Latino community. Why? Because we recognize what he doesn't, despite his immigrant wife, he does not recognize that in our families there are citizens and non-citizens with the same interests as a family. There's no distinction between the interests of a citizen child and his or her immigrant parents. Similarly, in our communities, there is a mixture. And we recognize our common interests and goals. And finally, not just in the Latino community, but throughout the vast majority of this country, there is a recognition of our common humanity. That word persons in the Constitution. Our common humanity. That we are all persons and we do not distinguish the rights of a person simply because they are not yet a citizen. But Donald Trump, through his continuing rhetoric, would like to see the public change its view in this country, to ignore our common humanity, our personhood, and to focus on who's a citizen and who's not a citizen, and drive a clear wall between us. Just like the other wall, he can't construct that wall if we together prevent him from doing so. But he's doing that in part because despite the fact he has an attorney general who doesn't know what the law is or care, despite the fact that he gets bad legal advice virtually every day of the week, there's a part of him that understands that our Constitution provides rights to persons. So he feels the need to demean some of us, the immigrants, as non-persons, to depict them as criminals, to depict them as non-human. And that we cannot allow. But in our community, and in the day laborer community, given the two examples I've already explained, our history is one of facing the very same issues, whether in Plyler versus Doe, or whether in those who would argue that day laborers don't have free speech rights over 20 years. And there are other stories. We've faced this demon before. Its hair may not have been as orange. Its skin may not have been unnaturally colored. But we faced this demon before, and over years we have defeated it. The demon that seeks to deprive all of us of our common humanity, that seeks to demean our law by creating distinctions between human beings that have no basis. I'm going to tell you one more story from history because I think it's that important. And that is, we have seen the forces against us from the very beginnings of our civil rights history try to change the terms that apply to us. As I said, I've had the great privilege of leading MALDEF, an organization that's celebrating its 50th anniversary this summer. Founded in 1968. But I'm going to go back even further than that to tell you about the very first case that went to our U.S. Supreme Court involving discrimination against the Latino community. This is a case called Hernandez versus Texas. Remember what I said, it's always Texas. It's always has been Texas. It is today Texas. It has the worst, most anti-immigrant law we've ever seen in SB 4. I urge you all to learn more about it. But Hernandez versus Texas went to the Supreme Court in 1954, the very same year that the African American community was taking its case against segregation in schools, Brown versus Board of Education, to the Supreme Court. Indeed, coincidentally, both cases, Hernandez and Brown, were decided in the same month, 2 weeks apart, May of 1954. Hernandez versus Texas involved a criminal case where a Latino defendant was seeking to challenge the fact that in Texas at that time, and it continued for many, many, many years after, but at that time, Texas did not allow Latinos to serve on juries. With the result that this Latino defendant faced an all-white jury with the prejudices that white Texans by and large carried at the time in their minds as they decided his fate. But his lawyers, including Latino lawyers, decided to challenge the exclusion of Latinos from juries in Texas. They thought they had a good argument because some 18 years previously, the United States Supreme Court, in a similar challenge by a black defendant to the exclusion of black jurors, the United States Supreme Court had decided you don't have to show racist discrimination to challenge jury exclusion. You don't have to have the jury commissioner or judge using racial epithets. All you have to show, the court said, 18 years before 1950, is that the long-standing pattern is that a racial group is left out of juries. So the mere fact that blacks had not been on juries for decades, in that case, was enough to demonstrate unlawful, unconstitutional discrimination in juries. So the lawyers for Pete Hernandez, in Hernandez versus Texas, raised the same argument and showed the same pattern, decades and decades, where no Latinos served on any jury. Only what they had not accounted for, that over the course of that 18 years, perhaps coincidentally, perhaps for other reasons, but over the course of those 18 years, if you look at the record, Latinos, Mexican Americans, Mexicans as they call them in Texas, were previously described as a different race from white people. The Mexican race, laws about the Mexican race, cases describing the Mexican race. But over the course of the 18 years between the Supreme Court establishing that rule and Hernandez versus Texas, the state of Texas decided that Mexicans were white. Now, you can imagine many of the Mexicans would look at their own skin color, would look at the way they were treated, would look at the fact brought out in the Hernandez decision that the very courthouse where Pete Hernandez was being prosecuted, there was one bathroom that's labeled white and one bathroom labeled colored, and hombres aquí. So, they didn't understand, many of them, necessarily why the state of Texas decided that Mexicans were white. But it all came together in Hernandez versus Texas, where the state of Texas argued that rule that you established 18 years ago, Supreme Court, about a pattern of exclusion, doesn't apply here because it's not the exclusion of a racial group. In fact, Mexicans are white. So Peter Hernandez, Mexican, had a jury entirely made up of white people. Therefore, that's his people. All white people. Convenient argument. All because they try to change the definition of race. Now the Supreme Court, in a unanimous 9-0 decision, concluded what we all would conclude here. That Texas was being Texas and had to change its practice. And the court said no matter what you call it, if you treat a group as different, you discriminate against them as with those bathrooms in the court, then they can call on the same test established 18 years before to challenge exclusion from jurors. So even then, the very beginnings of our Latino community's civil rights cases, law, we saw our having to contend with an attempt to change the meaning of a word. Not a word as basic as person, but equally important. What is a race and what is not? We had to battle it and defeat it in Hernandez versus Texas in 1954. So the truth is, the experience of day laborers over 20 years, the experience from Plyler in the 70s and 80s, goes back even further in our history. Now I guarantee you, Donald Trump doesn't know one bit about anything I just talked about. Doesn't know any of that history. Doesn't know any of that law. Doesn't care about anything. But as Pablo said, that means he doesn't know what he's facing. We have the history that goes back generations. We have the tenacity, we have the strength, and we have the power to face adversity and turn it around. And the law is a part of that, is a partner with organizing as we were in the 20-year campaign to defend the free speech rights of day laborers. The law and organizing together in our Latino community will defeat this demon one more time. So, of course, Puerto-Ricanos are citizens, but they have never been treated like equal citizens, in part because of the status of the island, in part obviously because the same thing that we saw in Texas. What it is, it is. They look at their skin color and they can't be the same as white Americans. So this is why you see Donald Trump believing he can treat Puerto Rico in response to a disaster in a way that he would never treat any state in this country, which is to ignore the infrastructure problems and fail to address them. He feels he can get away with it because while they are citizens, he doesn't see them as citizens. In fact, I doubt that he understands that they really are citizens. But it all grows out of what you all know, the discrimination And historically, a lot of that discrimination comes from when this nation went to war. So in the middle of the 19th century, when you go to war against Mexico, what do you have to do to convince the public to support it? Dehumanize. You have to dehumanize your enemy. Same with Puerto Rico in the early 20th century. If you're going to take over an island, how does a democracy justify taking over an island that belongs to other people? You dehumanize them. How do you justify intervention in Central America over years and years and years and years and years to the public? You dehumanize.
Cuando ahorita que dijiste, Pablo, también cuando hay un desastre natural, según dicen que no servimos los latinos, ¿por qué van y ayudan? Ahora en California se vio también de que andaban apagando, jornaleros andaban apagando el fuego, ¿por qué entonces requieren de mano hispana?
Miren, este es un argumento que nosotros tenemos que hacer más y más, ¿verdad? Si este país acepta los frutos de la mano de obra indocumentada, este país debe reconocer los derechos también de nuestra gente. No se vale que dame tu mano de obra, pero no voy a reconocer tus derechos, no voy a reconocer tu humanidad. Entonces nosotros sí tenemos que asegurar de que el valor de nuestro trabajo, ¿verdad?, lo elevamos lo más posible. Porque en esta batalla que estamos de migración hemos usado un montón de argumentos, que es malo, que las deportaciones son malas para la familia, que nuestra presencia aquí en los Estados Unidos es buena para la economía, etc. Hemos usado una cantidad de argumentos, pero el valor del trabajo que nosotros hacemos nunca lo hemos elevado lo suficiente. Y si usted, ¿a cuál esquina va usted?
¿Yo?
Sí, de aquí del...
Al 215 y la Eastern.
215 y la Eastern. Le aseguro de que si usted camina alrededor de la 215 y la Eastern y ve las casas pintadas y los jardines verdes y todo eso, por su trabajo y de todos sus compañeros y compañeras. Entonces, la clase patronal nunca va a reconocer ese trabajo, nunca lo va a llevar. Somos nosotros, a través de nuestras instituciones, de arriba. Cada vez que ustedes van y hacen un trabajo bonito, hacen un tile, hacen un baño, le ponen un tile, le ponen hasta, yo he visto que les ponen patrones, ¿verdad?, una foto y digan, así construimos este país, pónganla, publíquenla en todos lados, porque esa es la manera como vamos a ilustrar y elevar el valor de nuestro trabajo. Entonces es muy importante que hagamos eso a medida que avanzamos.
Sí, porque por ejemplo, cuando se hace un trabajo, pues yo miro, digo yo, wow, de la nada yo hice esta casa. Y yo traje gente y con mis manos y mi sudor está viviendo una familia.
Esa capacidad de creatividad es algo que le tiene miedo a Donald Trump. Esa capacidad. ¿Otra pregunta, otro comentario, algo que usted quiera compartir a partir de esta conversación que acabamos de tener ahorita, que ha estado muy rica? Esto significa de que todas estas ideas que traemos acá van a ser las ideas que los compañeros miembros del centro de arriba las van a llevar y las van a implementar. Ya van a ver.
La prensa publicó en los últimos meses que fueron deportados los soldados que defendieron la patria en Estados Unidos. Entonces, cabe mencionar que es una vergüenza que nada más nos hayan regresado apenas a uno o a poquitos, que nos regresen a todos.
Sí, muchas gracias, Miguel, por ese comentario. Nadie se salva de este proceso de deportación, ¿verdad? Yo creo que es muy importante lo que Chris mencionaba al principio, de que pues la intención más oscura es disminuir el número de inmigrantes no blancos. Porque Trump sí quería traer inmigrantes. ¿De dónde? ¿De cuál país? Norway. Y no quiere traer inmigrantes de nuestros países. ¿Cómo le llaman a nuestros países? Es mala palabra, ¿verdad? Entonces, es muy importante entender cuáles son sus intenciones. Miren las circunstancias en las que estamos. Ahorita ni estamos peleando para legalizar los 11 millones de documentados. Estamos peleando para mantener los papeles de personas que ya tenían papeles, el estatus de las personas que ya tenían papeles, los de DACA y los especiales, ¿verdad? Y porque no se trata de la gente indocumentada nada más, ¿verdad? Sino su intención es disminuir ese número de gente de color, ¿verdad? Por ese temor de que ellos creen de que van a perder su estatus de mayoría y que nosotros los vamos a oprimir. Pues están equivocados. Si ustedes ven el estado de California, ¿verdad? Cambió desde 1994 y podríamos decir de que la comunidad blanca sigue siendo el segmento étnico más poderoso de California todavía y más rico. No les ha pasado nada, todavía siguen teniendo sus riquezas, ¿verdad? Pero han habido cambios y los latinos tienen más poder político ahora, pero no está transformándose ese poder en perseguir a los blancos, ¿verdad? Al contrario, el poder político que nosotros queremos conseguir es para garantizar que todas las personas sean tratadas de una manera igual, es todo. Entonces esa idea, ese temor, como les dije, ese temor que ellos tienen, nosotros se lo vamos a remover con nuestra lucha, con nuestro ejemplo, ¿verdad? ¿Lo dejamos ahí? Sí. Perfecto.
Pregunta. No iba a decir. Bueno, ahorita antes de seguir con las preguntas, si quieren, no estoy usando esto, ¿saben apagarlas? Sí, no me quites el producto. Ella sí sabe. A ver, así es, se apaga. Ahora, con eso concluimos el programa aquí en la universidad. Vamos a dar un aplauso. Ahora, un aplauso. Tenemos más uno. Ahorita vamos los que pueden, vamos a ir avanzando ya al centro para asegurar que esté bonito. Ya está casi todo listo ayer, pero algunos queremos ir para ya ir calentando motores. Vamos. Tenemos un poco de tiempo. Si se quieren tomar todo. Y ahorita que bajemos todos, manden ahí una mesita acá abajo, déjenos.
Eso sí, pero posible que sea más bonito. Tengo que estar más bonito.